What if everything you were taught about the first people in America was wrong? Not a little wrong. Not slightly out of date. But deeply, completely, fundamentally incomplete. What if the neat and simple story you learned in school, that tidy little tale about people crossing a land bridge and walking into a new world roughly 13,000 years ago, was only a tiny fragment of something much older, much bigger, and much more wonderful than anyone guessed for most of the last century? Tonight, we are going to walk into that bigger story together. We are going to cross landscapes that no longer exist. We are going to stand beside lakes that dried up 15,000 years ago. We are going to kneel beside fires that burned out long before the pyramids of Egypt were even imagined. We are going to meet people whose names were never written down, whose languages left no written record, but whose footprints, whose tools, whose children's tiny handprints, whose very bones have survived in the earth for thousands upon thousands of years, waiting patiently and quietly to tell us who they were. This is not a story about conquest. It is not a story about empires or armies or great leaders on horseback. This is a much quieter story than that. This is a story about families. About mothers carrying babies across frozen ground under skies so wide they seem to curve at the edges. About fathers watching the horizon for signs of game, reading the wind the way you might read a book. About grandparents sitting close to the fire, passing down knowledge that would keep their people alive through another long, dark, freezing winter. About children playing at the edge of an ancient sea, leaving tiny footprints in the soft mud, footprints that would somehow, against all odds, last for more than 20,000 years. And here is what makes this story so alive, so vibrant, so exciting even right now, tonight as you listen. It is not finished. Every few years, sometimes every few months, someone somewhere in the Americas finds something buried in the ground. The bone. A stone tool chipped into shape by a human hand. A footprint pressed into ancient sediment. And when they find it, and when they date it, and when they study it, the whole story shifts again. What we know tonight is more than we knew 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, we will know things that would surprise us today. The story of the first Americans is one of the most exciting and rapidly changing stories in all of science. It is a detective story being solved in real time, and new clues keep turning up. So settle in. Let your body grow heavy and still. Let your breathing slow down, the way a wide river slows when it reaches a calm, deep, easy stretch of water. Feel the mattress or the pillow or whatever is holding you right now, and let it hold you completely. If you drift off during this journey, that is perfectly fine. That is wonderful, actually. That is exactly what this is for. This story will be here whenever you want to come back to it. Whether you hear every single word or whether you fall asleep somewhere along the ancient coastline of a world that no longer exists, let this story carry you wherever you need to go tonight. There is no test at the end. There is nothing you need to remember. There is only the story and the sound of a voice and the quiet dark around you. We begin not in America at all. We begin somewhere else entirely. We begin in a world of ice. To understand how people first reached the Americas, you need to understand the world they came from. And that world was deeply, strangely, almost unrecognizably different from ours. Imagine you could look down at Earth from space, 26,000 years ago. The planet is the same shape. The same continents sit in the same positions. The same moon hangs in the sky, and the same sun rises every morning and sets every evening. But something is different. Something enormous and white covers huge stretches of the land surface, spreading across the northern parts of the planet like a slow, frozen tide. Unimaginable, staggering, almost incomprehensible amounts of ice. Across North America, a continuous sheet of ice stretches from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Pacific. It covers everything that is now Canada. It pushes south into what is now the United States, reaching as far down as the present-day locations of New York City, Chicago, and Seattle. And this is not a thin layer. This is not the kind of ice that forms on a pond in winter. In places, this ice sheet is more than 2 miles thick. 2 full miles of solid ice stacked on top of the Earth. That is higher than the tallest mountains most people have ever seen. If you could somehow stand at the very base of this ice sheet and tilt your head back and look up, you would not see the top. It would disappear into the sky above you, vanishing into the clouds, too high and too immense for your eyes to take in. Scientists call this period the last glacial maximum, and it represents the most recent time in Earth's history when the planet's ice sheets reached their greatest size. The peak was roughly 26,000 years ago, though the cold had been building for a very long time before that, and it lingered for thousands of years afterward. This was not a sudden freeze. It was a slow, patient, relentless accumulation of cold and ice that transformed the face of the planet over tens of thousands of years. The weight of all this ice was almost beyond calculation. And that weight had consequences. The ice was so heavy that it actually pushed the surface of the Earth downward, bending the rocky crust of the planet the way your body bends a soft mattress when you lie down on it. The land beneath the ice was pressed lower, squeezed down by the sheer mass above it. Thousands of years in the future, when the ice finally melted, the land would begin to slowly rise back up, like that mattress gradually returning to its shape after you stand. In parts of Scandinavia and in parts of Canada, this rebound is still happening today. The land is still rising, still recovering from the weight of ice that vanished more than 10,000 years ago. The Earth has a long memory. Now, here is the part that matters most for our story. All that ice changed the shape of the world in a very specific and very important way. When water freezes into glaciers on land, that water has to come from somewhere. And it comes from the oceans. During the last glacial maximum, so much of the world's ocean water was locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea levels dropped by roughly 400 feet. 400 feet. Think about that number for a moment. That is taller than the Statue of Liberty from the base of her pedestal to the tip of her torch. That is taller than a 30-story office building. Imagine the ocean pulling back that far from every single coastline on Earth. The consequences were dramatic. Beaches that you might visit today simply did not exist back then. The shoreline was miles and miles inland from where the actual coast was during the Ice Age. Vast stretches of what is now seafloor were dry, open, walkable ground. You could have strolled across land where fish swim today. The map of the world looked profoundly, startlingly different from any map you have ever seen. And when sea levels drop that far, things that are now separated by water become connected. Islands become peninsulas. Peninsulas become part of the mainland. Entire new landscapes emerge from beneath the waves. Australia was joined to New Guinea, forming one enormous landmass. Britain was connected to the European continent, with the English Channel reduced to a wide, grassy river valley. Japan was attached to mainland Asia. And between what is now the eastern tip of Russia and what is now the western edge of Alaska, where today a narrow, cold, shallow body of water called the Bering Strait separates the two continents by roughly 55 miles, there was no water at all. There was land. And not just a little strip of land. Not a thin, precarious ribbon barely wide enough to walk across, which is how some old textbooks used to draw it. This was a vast, wide, open, habitable landscape stretching nearly 1,000 miles from its northern edge to its southern edge. 1,000 miles. That is roughly the distance from Chicago to New York. You could fit the entire country of France inside this landscape and still have room left over. Scientists call this lost land Beringia, and it is one of the most important pieces of geography in the entire story of our species. Because it was from Beringia, or along its coasts, that human beings first set foot in the Western Hemisphere. For the first time in the entire history of life on Earth, human eyes looked out across the land that would one day be called America. But Beringia was not what most people picture. It was not a frozen highway to be crossed as quickly as possible. It was a world of its own. A place where people lived for thousands of years. And understanding what Beringia was actually like, the plants that grew there, the animals that roamed its grasslands, the people who called it home, is essential to understanding everything that came after. The ice held the world in its grip. The oceans pulled back from the shore. And between two great continents, a land that no longer exists waited in the cold light, full of grass and wind and life. When most people hear the words land bridge, they imagine something narrow, something thin and precarious. A strip of land with water on both sides, barely wide enough for a line of people to walk across single file, heading from Asia to America the way you might cross a footbridge in a park. You may have seen this image in an old textbook, or in a documentary, or in a museum display. A narrow connection. A temporary crossing. A place to pass through on the way to somewhere else. That image is wrong. It is one of the biggest and most persistent misconceptions in all of popular history. And letting go of it is the first step toward understanding the real story of the first Americans. Beringia was not a bridge. Beringia was a subcontinent. At its widest, during the peak of the Ice Age when sea levels were at their lowest, the exposed land of Beringia stretched nearly 1,000 miles from north to south. You could have walked for weeks across it and never reached the other side. You could have spent your entire life there and never come close to the edge. This was not a narrow connection. This was an enormous, open, livable landscape, and people did not hurry across it. They lived on it. And the second misconception we need to set aside is the idea that Beringia was a frozen wasteland. A barren, lifeless desert of ice and snow, too harsh for anything to survive, a place that humans could only endure, never enjoy. This image is also wrong, and the scientific evidence tells us a very different story. Beringia was cold. Make no mistake about that. The winters were long, dark, and punishing. Temperatures dropped far below zero for months at a time. The wind came screaming across the open landscape with nothing to stop it, no mountains, no forests, nothing but flat, endless ground from horizon to horizon. Snow piled up in drifts. The rivers froze solid. The days in midwinter were short and dim, the sun barely clearing the southern horizon before sinking back down again. But Beringia was not a dead place. It was what scientists call a mammoth steppe or steppe tundra, a unique type of ecosystem that has no exact equivalent in the modern world. It was a vast, treeless grassland, similar in some ways to the open steppes of Central Asia and in other ways to the tundra of the modern Arctic. And during the brief but powerful summer months, this landscape came alive. The grasses grew quickly in the long summer days, taking advantage of nearly 24 hours of sunlight in the northernmost parts. Sedges and rushes lined the banks of rivers and streams. Low shrubs, dwarf willows and birches that grew no higher than your waist, clung to sheltered valleys and the south-facing slopes of low hills. Wildflowers bloomed in short, brilliant bursts of color, bright yellows and purples and whites appearing almost overnight, lasting for a few weeks, and then vanishing as the cold returned. The air hummed with insects. Butterflies drifted over the grass. And birds, millions upon millions of migratory birds, arrived from the south to breed in the long daylight, filling the sky with their calls and covering the tundra ponds with their nesting colonies. And the animals. The animals of Beringia were extraordinary. This was one of the richest communities of large mammals anywhere on Earth. Woolly mammoths were the most iconic. They moved across the landscape in family groups of 5 to 15 individuals, led by an experienced older female, just as African elephants are today. Their bodies were wrapped in a double coat of fur, a long, coarse outer layer of reddish-brown guard hairs that could reach 3 feet in length, and beneath that, a dense, insulating undercoat of shorter, softer wool. Their tusks were enormous, curving upward and inward, sometimes crossing at the tips, and could grow to more than 10 feet long. They used these tusks for many things: for clearing snow from the grass they ate, for stripping bark from the occasional shrub, for fighting during mating season, and perhaps simply for display. A full-grown woolly mammoth stood about 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed between 4 and 6 tons. The sound of a mammoth heard on the move, the low rumble of their footsteps, the constant grinding of their enormous teeth against the tough grass stems, must have been one of the defining sounds of the Beringian landscape. You would have felt it in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Steppe bison grazed in large herds across the grasslands. These animals were bigger and more powerfully built than the bison that still live in North America today, with wider horn spans and more muscular shoulders. Caribou migrated across Beringia in vast numbers, following the seasons north in summer and south in winter, their hooves clicking on the frozen ground. Musk oxen gathered in small groups, their long, shaggy wool sweeping almost to the ground, their short, curved horns ready to defend against any predator that came too close. Saiga antelope, with their strange, bulbous, downward-pointing noses that filtered dust and warmed the freezing air before it reached their lungs, trotted across the open steppe in loose herds. And horses. Horses were everywhere in Beringia. Small, sturdy, thick-necked horses with heavy winter coats, grazing on the same grass that the mammoths and bison ate. The horse evolved in North America millions of years ago and was perfectly at home on the Beringian steppe. Where there were herds of grazers, there were predators. Gray wolves hunted in packs, their howls carrying for miles across the flat landscape. They followed the caribou primarily, picking off the old, the sick, the very young. The short-faced bear, Arctidus simus, was the largest land predator in the ecosystem. It stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder when on all fours and could rear up to 11 or 12 feet on its hind legs. Its legs were unusually long for a bear, suggesting it could cover ground quickly. Some scientists think it may have been more of a scavenger than an active hunter, using its size to steal kills from other predators. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive today, were the top cat predators, powerful enough to bring down a young bison or a horse. Into this rich, dynamic, challenging world came people. We know from archaeological evidence that humans were living in northeastern Siberia at least 32,000 years ago. At a site called Yana Rhinoceros Horn, located deep in the Siberian Arctic at a latitude where the winter temperatures regularly drop below -40 degrees, archaeologists found a collection of beautifully made tools crafted from rhinoceros horn, mammoth ivory, and stone. These were not crude, simple tools. They were sophisticated, carefully shaped, and showed a deep understanding of the materials being worked. The people who made them had inherited thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to live in extreme cold. They knew how to build shelters. They knew how to make warm clothing from animal hides and furs. They knew how to hunt large, dangerous animals cooperatively. They knew how to store food for the lean months. They were experts in survival. At some point, some of these Siberian people began moving eastward into Beringia. This was not a dramatic event. There was no moment of decision, no leader pointing east and saying, "Let us go that way." It was simply the natural, slow, generation-by-generation expansion of a human population following the resources it depended on. A family moves to a new campsite a few miles away because the hunting is better there. Their grandchildren move a few miles further. Over centuries, over millennia, the population spreads, slowly and steadily, like water seeping across a flat surface. The people who moved into Beringia probably did not even realize they had crossed from one geological region into another. There was no sign, no border, no line on the ground. Just more grass, more sky, more mammoths, more of the same open, windswept world they had always known. And here is where the story takes a remarkable turn. These people, the ancestors of all or most Native Americans, did not simply pass through Beringia on their way somewhere else. They stayed. Geneticists have discovered this through the study of DNA, both from modern indigenous peoples of the Americas and from ancient human remains found at various sites across the Western Hemisphere. When they analyze the genetic signatures, they find something interesting. The ancestral Native American populations split off from other Asian populations a very long time ago, much earlier than they actually appear in the Americas. There is a gap of several thousand years between the time this population became genetically distinct and the time their descendants show up in North or South America. This idea is called the Beringian standstill hypothesis, and it was developed by several geneticists, including Erica Tam, Connie Mulligan, and others. The hypothesis proposes that the ancestors of Native Americans lived in Beringia as an isolated population for roughly 2,000 to 8,000 years. During this long standstill, they were cut off from the populations back in Siberia to the west, and they had not yet moved into the Americas to the east. They were in between, living on a land that no longer exists, developing their own genetic identity, building their own culture, adapting to conditions that would serve them well in the new world that lay ahead. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of years of human life. Thousands of years of births and deaths, of children growing up and having children of their own, of songs sung and stories told and tools made and fires lit. All of it happening on a piece of land that is now at the bottom of the sea. Beringia is gone. swallowed by the rising ocean when the ice melted and the water came back. But the people who lived there are not gone. Their descendants number in the tens of millions. Their DNA carries the signature of those long, cold, windswept centuries between two worlds. Somewhere in the vastness of Beringia, at some point during the long millennia of the standstill, something happened. Some group of people, some family or band or cluster of families, began to move east. Not with any grand purpose. Not with any knowledge of what lay ahead. Just moving, as humans always move, following the animals, looking for better ground, seeking the next good campsite along the next river. And one day, without knowing it, they crossed a threshold. They stepped from Beringia into the land that would one day be called Alaska. And from there, somehow, through routes and by means that scientists are still working to understand, they spread southward into the rest of the Americas. How they did it, and when they did it, is one of the great questions in science. And the answers have been changing rapidly. Let that image stay with you as you rest. A family on the move. Smoke from their last campfires still visible behind them. Ahead, nothing but open country. They do not know where they are going. They do not know that they are the first. They are just walking. Into the wind. Into the unknown. Into the future. Here is a question that has consumed archaeologists for more than a century. It has sparked bitter arguments, ended friendships, damaged careers, and inspired some of the most remarkable detective work in the history of science. The question seems simple. When did the first human beings arrive in the Americas? For most of the 20th century, the answer was confident and clear. Approximately 13,000 years ago. That was when a group of people known to archaeologists as the Clovis culture appeared in the archaeological record, leaving behind their distinctive and beautifully made stone spear points at sites scattered across North America. The Clovis people, said the textbooks, were the first Americans. They had crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia, walked south through an ice-free corridor between the great glaciers that covered Canada, emerged onto the open plains, and spread across the continent. It was a neat, clean, satisfying story. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it was wrong. But for decades, this story, known as the Clovis first model, was not merely a theory to be tested. It was practically a commandment. Archaeologists who found evidence suggesting human presence in the Americas before the Clovis period were met with hostility. Their methods were attacked. Their dating was questioned. Their professional reputations suffered. The archaeological establishment had invested heavily in Clovis first, and it was not prepared to give it up easily. And then came White Sands. White Sands National Park sits in the Tularosa Basin of south-central New Mexico. It is one of the most visually stunning landscapes in North America, a vast field of brilliant white gypsum sand dunes stretching across nearly 300 square miles. The sand is so white it looks like fresh snow. The dunes move and shift with the wind, constantly reshaping themselves, burying things and uncovering them in an endless, slow dance. Near the eastern margin of the park, along the edges of what was once a large body of water called Lake Otero, park researchers and rangers began to notice something unusual emerging from the flat, cracked surface of the ancient lakebed as erosion slowly peeled away the upper layers. Footprints. Human footprints. Not one or two, but dozens, then hundreds, pressed into hardened layers of mud and mineral sediment, preserved by the same geological processes that had buried them. At first, the discovery was interesting but seemed manageable. Ancient human footprints have been found in a few other places around the world, including the famous trackways at Litoli in Tanzania, which are millions of years old. Finding human footprints in New Mexico was notable, but it was not immediately clear just how significant the find would turn out to be. And then the dating results came back. The dating was performed using radiocarbon analysis of seeds from an aquatic plant called Ruppia serosa, a type of ditch grass or widgeon grass that grows in shallow, brackish water. These seeds were embedded in the exact same layers of sediment as the footprints, deposited at the same time the tracks were made, sealed together in the same thin sheets of mud and mineral crust. When the radiocarbon results were calculated, they pointed to an age range of 21,000 to 23,000 years before the present. Take a moment with that number. 21 to 23,000 years. That is squarely during the last glacial maximum, the period when the ice sheets covering North America were at their very largest. That is 8 to 10,000 years before the Clovis people, the people who were supposed to be first. According to the old model, no human being should have been anywhere in the Americas at that time. And yet, here were their footprints. In New Mexico. The results were published in the journal Science in September of 2021, in a paper led by Matthew Bennett and Sally Reynolds. The reaction was immediate, intense, and divided. Many scientists recognized the discovery for what it was, a fundamental shift in our understanding of when the Americas were first populated. Others were more cautious, raising legitimate questions about the dating methods. And a few dug in their heels, defending the old model against what the evidence was clearly showing. But the footprints told us far more than a date. They told us stories. Small, quiet, deeply human stories. These tracks were not made by a single person on a single afternoon. They represent many separate visits to this lakeshore over a span of roughly 2,000 years. Generation after generation of people came to this place. The footprints include those of adults, teenagers, and young children. Some of the adult prints are large and deep, pressed firmly into the soft ground by people walking with confidence and purpose. Some of the prints are mid-sized, made by adolescents. And some are very small, tiny, made by children who could not have been more than 4 or 5 years old, their little toes splayed wide against the wet mud, their stride short and unsteady. Among the most moving of all the trackways is one that appears to tell a small, wordless story. An adult is walking along the lakeshore. Their prints are steady, deep, and evenly spaced. A child is walking beside them, their prints smaller and lighter. Then something changes. The adult's footprints suddenly become deeper on one side and shallower on the other, asymmetric, as though they are carrying something heavy. At the same time, the child's footprints disappear. The adult has picked up the child. They walk on together, the adult's lopsided prints the only evidence of their passage. Then, a little farther along, the adult's prints return to normal symmetry, and the child's footprints reappear on the ground beside them. The adult has set the child down again, and the little one is walking on their own. A parent carrying a tired child. More than 20,000 years ago. In a landscape we can barely imagine. Setting the child down to walk. And the child's tiny feet pressing into the mud. And the mud hardening. And the minerals seeping in. And the layers of sediment piling up. And 20,000 years passing. And then, one day, the wind and the rain stripping away the layers, and those little footprints appearing again in the sunlight of a New Mexico afternoon. Waiting to be found. It is one of the most intimate and human pieces of evidence in all of archaeology. Other trackways at White Sands show humans and megafauna sharing the same landscape. In one remarkable sequence, human footprints appear to follow the tracks of a giant ground sloth. The sloth's tracks show it rearing up, pivoting, and changing direction, as though it became aware that something was following it. Whether this represents hunting, curiosity, or something else entirely, we cannot say for certain. But it shows, vividly and directly, that people and Ice Age megafauna were here at the same time, aware of each other, interacting in the same physical space. Now, as with any major scientific claim, the White Sands dates were subjected to rigorous scrutiny. This is how science is supposed to work, and the scrutiny was both expected and healthy. The primary concern raised by skeptics was something called the hardwater effect. Ruppia serosa is an aquatic plant, and aquatic plants can sometimes absorb old carbon dissolved in lake water, carbon from ancient limestone or other geological sources. If the Ruppia seeds had absorbed this old carbon, their radiocarbon ages would appear older than they actually were. It was a legitimate concern. The research team took it seriously. They returned to White Sands and collected new samples for dating, this time using entirely different materials. They radiocarbon dated pollen from land-based conifer trees, specifically pine pollen, which would have absorbed its carbon from the atmosphere, not from lake water, and therefore would not be affected by the hard water problem. The pine pollen dates confirmed the original seed dates. The footprints were indeed more than 20,000 years old. Then, in 2023, the team published additional confirmation using a completely different dating technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. This method does not measure carbon at all. Instead, it measures when tiny mineral grains in the sediment were last exposed to sunlight. When grains are buried, they accumulate a small electrical charge from natural background radiation. The longer they are buried, the larger the charge. By measuring this charge in a laboratory, scientists can determine how long ago the grains were last at the surface. The OSL dates from white sands agreed with both the seed dates and the pollen dates. 3 independent dating methods. 3 different types of material. 3 different scientific principles. And they all pointed to the same answer. People were walking along the shore of Lake Otero during the last glacial maximum, more than 20,000 years ago. The Clovis first model, already weakened by decades of pre-Clovis discoveries at sites around the Americas, was now conclusively overturned. The first Americans were here much earlier than the old textbooks said. But white sands did not appear in a vacuum. By the time those footprints made headlines in 2021, a long list of other sites had already been chipping away at the Clovis first idea for decades. The archaeologists who championed those sites had often paid a steep price for their persistence. And their stories are worth telling. Let the quiet settle around you. The footprints are still there, in the white sand, under the New Mexico sun. Patient as they have always been. The record of ordinary people doing ordinary things in a world that has been waiting more than 20,000 years to be remembered. There is a popular idea that science moves forward in a straight, orderly line. That each new discovery is welcomed with open arms, slotted neatly into the growing body of knowledge, and the whole enterprise advances smoothly toward truth. It is a comforting picture. It is also almost entirely wrong. In reality, science is done by people. And people are complicated. They have careers to protect, reputations to defend, and theories they have spent their lives building. When new evidence threatens the theory a scientist has championed for 30 years, the natural human response is not always to say, "How wonderful, I was wrong." Sometimes the response is to say, "The evidence must be wrong, because my theory is right." The history of pre-Clovis archaeology in the Americas is a story about evidence, yes. But it is also a story about what happens when evidence runs headlong into established belief. It is a story about courage, stubbornness, patience, and the slow, grinding, sometimes painful process by which science eventually corrects itself. The most famous and most important early challenge to the Clovis first model came from the most unlikely of places. Not from Alaska, which sits right next to the supposed entry point from Asia. Not from the Great Plains of the United States, where Clovis points had first been discovered. The challenge came from the extreme southern end of South America, from a small site along a creek in Chile, about as far from the Bering Strait as you can get and still be in the Americas. In the late 1970s, a young American archaeologist named Tom Dillehay began excavating a site called Monte Verde, located along Chinchihuapi Creek near the city of Puerto Montt in southern Chile. The site had come to attention when local residents noticed large bones eroding out of the creek bank. Dillehay began to dig, carefully, methodically, layer by layer. And beneath a thick blanket of peat, a layer of decomposed plant material that had sealed the site like a natural time capsule, he found something extraordinary. The peat had preserved the remains of a small settlement with remarkable clarity. Wooden stakes and poles that had once supported shelters covered in animal hides. Fragments of the hides themselves. Stone tools that were quite different in style from Clovis points, less refined in some ways but clearly the work of human hands. Pieces of cord and string twisted from plant fibers. Knotted lengths of what appeared to be rope. And food. Preserved food. Wild potatoes. Edible seeds. Various fruits and plant remains. And, most remarkably, several types of seaweed, including species that grow only in the ocean, which must have been carried to the site from the Pacific coast, a distance of more than 50 miles. The seaweed was particularly telling. It showed that the Monte Verde people were not isolated in their little creekside camp. They were connected to the coast, either traveling there themselves or trading with coastal people. They had a network. They had knowledge that extended well beyond the immediate area where they lived. They were not refugees clinging to survival. They were people with resources, relationships, and strategies. The radiocarbon dates from Monteverde placed the occupation at roughly 14,500 years before the present. That was more than 1,000 years older than the earliest accepted Clovis sites in North America. Stop and think about what that means. People were already living at the very tip of South America, more than 10,000 miles from Beringia, at a time before the Clovis culture even existed. To have reached Chile by 14,500 years ago, people must have been in North America considerably earlier. You cannot walk or boat from Alaska to Chile in a single generation. The journey, even along the fastest plausible route, the Pacific coast, would have taken hundreds of years at minimum, and more likely thousands of years. If they were in Chile 14,500 years ago, they were probably in North America 16,000, 18,000, perhaps 20,000 years ago or more. When Delahaye published his findings, the response from large portions of the archaeological world was not welcoming. It was hostile. His excavation methods were criticized. His interpretation of the wooden remains was questioned. Some skeptics argued that what he identified as human-made artifacts were actually natural formations. His radiocarbon dates were challenged on various technical grounds. For years, Delahaye found himself defending his work against a barrage of criticism from established archaeologists who had built their careers on the Clovis first model and were not prepared to abandon it. The criticism was not entirely unjustified. Science demands high standards of evidence, especially for claims that overturn established models. The skeptics were asking fair questions. But the tone was often personal and harsh, going beyond scientific debate into something more like professional punishment for challenging the orthodoxy. The turning point came in 1997 when a delegation of prominent archaeologists, including some of the most vocal critics, traveled to Chile to examine the Monteverde site and its evidence firsthand. They spent days going over the artifacts, the stratigraphy, the dating, and the context. When they emerged, most of them agreed. Monteverde was genuine. The evidence was solid. People had been in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, more than a millennium before Clovis. Today, Monteverde is recognized as one of the most important archaeological sites in the entire Western Hemisphere. Tom Delahaye is celebrated for his persistence and his courage. But the years of professional criticism and personal stress he endured were very real, and his experience served as a warning to other archaeologists who might be tempted to challenge the establishment. Despite that warning, other archaeologists kept digging. And they kept finding things. In southwestern Pennsylvania, a large, shallow cave formed by a natural overhang of sandstone rock had been providing shelter to people for thousands of years. The site is called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and beginning in the early 1970s, an archaeologist named James Adavaggio began a meticulous, long-term excavation there. Adavaggio was a careful, detail-oriented scientist, and he documented everything with extraordinary precision. Layer by layer, he dug down through the deposits inside the shelter, peeling back centuries and millennia of human occupation. At the bottom, in the oldest layers, he found stone tools and evidence of fire use that radiocarbon dating placed at 16,000 years ago. And possibly at the very deepest levels, as far back as 19,000 years. Like Delahaye, Adavaggio faced years of criticism. Skeptics suggested that coal particles from natural seams in the surrounding rock might have contaminated his radiocarbon samples, making the dates appear older than they really were. Adavaggio addressed these concerns methodically, one by one, over the course of many years. He demonstrated that the coal contamination hypothesis did not fit the evidence. Today, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is widely accepted as one of the oldest reliably dated sites of human habitation in North America. Far to the west, in the dry, sagebrush-covered hills of south-central Oregon, archaeologist Dennis Jenkins was working in a group of shallow caves called the Paisley Caves. And there he found something that is particularly difficult to argue with. Human coprolites. That is the polite, dignified, scientific term for dried human feces. Jenkins found these coprolites in cave sediments dating to more than 14,000 years ago. When the coprolites were analyzed in a laboratory, they yielded human DNA. Not animal DNA. Not ambiguous organic material that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Human DNA, confirmed through careful laboratory analysis. Somebody was living in those caves 14,000 years ago, eating food, digesting it, leaving behind the most fundamental biological evidence of their existence. It is hard to challenge the presence of human DNA in human waste found in a datable layer of cave sediment. In central Texas, at a site called Galt, archaeologists digging below the well-known Clovis layer found something that had no business being there according to the old model. A different, older set of stone tools. These tools, now called the Galt assemblage, dated to more than 16,000 years ago. They were clearly human-made, showing the characteristic flaking patterns of intentional stone tool manufacture. But they were not Clovis points. They represented a different, earlier technology. At Cooper's Ferry, a site along the Salmon River in western Idaho, archaeologist Loren Davis and his team uncovered evidence of human occupation dating back more than 16,000 years. The tools found at Cooper's Ferry were especially interesting because they did not strongly resemble tools from Siberia, which is what you would expect if people had come across the Bering Land Bridge by the traditional interior route. Instead, they showed similarities to stone tools found in Japan, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. This unexpected connection hinted at a coastal migration route and at cultural links between the very earliest Americans and peoples of the western Pacific Rim. And there were more sites. The Buttermilk Creek Complex in Texas. The Cactus Hill Site in Virginia. The Topper Site in South Carolina. The Deborah L. Friedkin Site, also in Texas, where thousands of stone artifacts were found beneath the Clovis layer in a clear stratigraphic sequence. Pagelatson in Florida, where stone tools and the butchered bones of a mastodon were recovered from an underwater sinkhole and dated to more than 14,500 years ago. The Huaca Prieta site on the arid coast of northern Peru, where evidence of human occupation stretches back more than 15,000 years. One by one, decade by decade, the sites piled up. Each one was another crack in the wall of the Clovis first model. Each one was another piece of evidence that people had been in the Americas far longer than the old story allowed. The model did not collapse in one dramatic moment. It eroded gradually, like a sandstone cliff worn away by decades of wind and rain, as stubborn, patient, courageous archaeologists kept digging and kept finding what the earth had been holding. By the time the White Sands footprints were announced in 2021, the Clovis first model was already fatally weakened. White Sands did not kill it. White Sands simply provided the final, definitive blow. And what has replaced the old model is something far more complex, far more uncertain, and far more interesting. A picture of multiple migrations, multiple routes, and a human presence in the Americas that stretches back not 13,000 years, but 20,000 years or more. And this raises an enormous question. If people were in the Americas during the last glacial maximum, when enormous ice sheets blocked the interior of the continent, how did they get past the ice? The traditional route, the ice-free corridor that supposedly ran between the two great Canadian ice sheets, was not passable until roughly 14,000 years ago. People at White Sands were there 7,000 to 9,000 years before that corridor opened. They needed another way in. The answer, an increasing number of scientists believe, involves seaweed, boats, and a remarkable ecological highway that stretched along the entire Pacific coast. Let your breathing slow. We are going to follow the edge of the sea now. And the story it tells is one of the most beautiful in all of human history. If the first Americans did not wait for the inland ice to melt and the ice-free corridor to open, then how did they get here? How did people reach White Sands in New Mexico 23,000 years ago when a continuous wall of ice 2 miles thick blocked the interior of North America? How did people reach Monteverde in Chile 14,500 years ago? For most of the 20th century, the only path that anyone seriously considered was through the interior. The ice-free corridor, a supposed gap between the Laurentide ice sheet to the east and the Cordilleran ice sheet to the west, running roughly along what is now the border between the Canadian provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. When the ice sheets were at their maximum, this corridor was closed, sealed shut by the merging of the two ice masses. But as the ice began to melt, The corridor is thought to have opened up, perhaps around 14,000 years ago, creating a narrow, habitable passage from Alaska down to the northern Great Plains. For decades, this was assumed to be the route the first Americans took. Walk across Beringia, enter Alaska, wait for the corridor to open, walk south through the gap, emerge on the plains, and spread across the continent. Simple. Logical. But if people were already in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, the corridor opened far too late to explain their presence. And even for later arrivals, there are problems. Recent studies of the ice-free corridor environment suggest that even after it opened, it was a bleak, barren, and resource-poor landscape for perhaps 1,000 years. There were no forests, no established plant communities, and very little animal life. Traveling through it would have meant walking through hundreds of miles of essentially lifeless terrain, with nothing to eat and no shelter from the elements. It would have been possible, perhaps, but it would not have been attractive. People generally move toward food, not away from it. So where did the earliest Americans go, if not through the middle of the ice? Along the edge of it. The anthropologist John Erlandson of the University of Oregon has been one of the most prominent advocates for what he calls the Kelp Highway hypothesis. It is one of the most elegant and compelling ideas in the study of the first Americans, and it has gained increasing acceptance over the past 2 decades. The idea rests on a simple observation. During the Ice Age, the entire Pacific Rim, from Japan and the coasts of northeastern Asia through the Beringian coastline, and all the way down the west coast of the Americas to the tip of South America, was lined by a chain of extraordinarily productive coastal ecosystems. And at the foundation of these ecosystems was kelp. Kelp is a type of large brown seaweed that grows in cold, nutrient-rich, rocky coastal waters. You may have seen it if you have ever visited the Pacific coast. Individual kelp plants can grow astonishingly large, more than 100 feet from their root-like holdfasts on the seafloor to their floating canopy at the surface. Their long, leathery fronds, brown or dark green, sway gently with the ocean currents, creating an underwater landscape that looks remarkably like a forest. And just like a forest on land, a kelp forest teems with life. The diversity and abundance of life in a kelp forest is almost overwhelming. Fish of every size find shelter among the fronds, from tiny juveniles hiding from predators to large adults cruising through the canopy hunting for prey. Sea otters, those charming, playful animals, are intimately connected to kelp forests. They hunt in them, feed in them, and wrap themselves in kelp fronds to sleep, floating on their backs at the surface, anchored gently by the seaweed so the current does not carry them away while they rest. At the base of the kelp, where the plants attach to rocks on the seafloor, shellfish of many kinds cluster in dense communities. Mussels, abalone, clams, limpets. Sea urchins graze on the kelp itself. Crabs and lobsters crawl across the bottom, scavenging and hunting in the complex habitat created by the kelp. Seals and sea lions are frequent visitors, hunting fish among the fronds and hauling out on nearby rocks to rest, to breed, to raise their pups. Above the water, seabirds by the thousands dive and plunge and float, feeding on the abundance below. For human beings who knew how to use the sea, a kelp forest was everything. It was an endless, self-renewing source of protein from fish and shellfish, fat from sea mammals, vitamins and minerals from the seaweed itself, which is edible and nutritious, fresh water from streams and rivers that empty into the sea along the coast, driftwood for building fires and constructing shelters, materials for making tools, cordage, and containers. A kelp-rich coastline provided everything a small group of people needed not just to survive but to live well. Erlandson's great insight was that during the Ice Age, this chain of kelp forest ecosystems was virtually continuous. It stretched along the entire Pacific Rim like a green highway following the coast. People who were already adapted to coastal living in Northeast Asia, people who already knew how to fish, how to gather shellfish, how to hunt sea mammals, and crucially, how to build and navigate boats, could follow this kelp highway southward along the coast of the Americas. They would never be far from food. They would never be far from fresh water. They would never need to cross the interior ice sheets at all. And this migration would not have looked like a march or an expedition. It would have looked like normal life. A family settles at a productive stretch of coast. They build shelters from driftwood and hides. They fish. They gather mussels and clams from the rocks at low tide. Their children grow up knowing every tide pool, every rocky outcrop, every place where the seals haul out. They live there for years, perhaps decades. Eventually, some members of the group, maybe the younger generation looking for their own territory, move a few miles down the coast. They find another cove, another river mouth, another stretch of kelp-rich water. They settle there. And their children, in turn, move a little farther. Over hundreds of years, over thousands of years, this slow, natural, generational drift carries the population southward along the entire Pacific coast. The beauty of the Kelp Highway hypothesis is that it explains the speed and extent of the initial settlement. If people were traveling by boat along a food-rich coastline, they could cover ground much faster than people walking through unfamiliar, potentially resource-poor interior landscapes. And they could bypass the ice sheets entirely, skirting along the coast while the glaciers towered inland. This explains how people could have reached Chile 14,500 years ago, at Monteverde, so soon after the ice sheets began to melt. They were already there. They had been moving along the coast for thousands of years. But there is a problem with the Kelp Highway hypothesis, and it is a significant one. The evidence is mostly underwater. Remember, during the Ice Age, sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. The coastline that those first maritime people would have lived along is now submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean. Their campsites, their fire pits, their shell middens, the piles of discarded shells that accumulate wherever coastal people eat shellfish, all of it is underwater. Finding direct archaeological evidence of the coastal migration requires underwater archaeology in cold, murky, often dangerous waters. It is expensive. It is technically challenging. And the sites, if they exist, are buried under thousands of years of accumulated marine sediment. And yet, despite these enormous challenges, pieces of evidence have been found. On the Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California, John Erlandson and his colleagues discovered stone tools and the remains of shellfish meals dating back more than 12,000 years. The Channel Islands were islands even during the Ice Age, separated from the mainland by a stretch of open water. People needed boats to reach them. The presence of 12,000-year-old artifacts on the Channel Islands is direct evidence that people on the Pacific coast had watercraft and the skill to use them. On Triquet Island, off the coast of British Columbia in Canada, archaeologists from the Hakai Institute, working in collaboration with the Heiltsuk First Nation, uncovered evidence of a human settlement dating back roughly 14,000 years. The site yielded charcoal from ancient campfires, fish bones, and stone tools. It sits in an area that the Heiltsuk people have long identified in their oral traditions as a place where their ancestors sheltered during the time of ice. The archaeology and the oral tradition tell the same story. Further south, along the coast of Peru, the ancient site of Huaca Prieta shows that people were living on the Pacific coast of South America more than 15,000 years ago, eating fish, shellfish, and seaweed. Analysis of plant and animal remains at the site shows a population deeply adapted to coastal resources. The evidence is still fragmentary. The great underwater sites that would conclusively prove the Kelp Highway have not yet been found. But the circumstantial case is strong and growing stronger every year as new technologies, including deep-sea sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and advanced underwater excavation techniques, make it possible to explore the submerged ancient coastline in ways that were not possible a generation ago. Imagine the world those first coastal people knew. The rhythmic sound of waves breaking against rock. The smell of salt water and kelp, rich and organic, drying in the sun. The cries of seabirds, gulls and terns and cormorants, wheeling in the sky above a kelp bed. A small fire burning on a beach of dark stone, driftwood crackling, smoke rising into still evening air. A family gathered around the fire after a day of fishing and gathering. Children playing at the water's edge, their bare feet splashing in the shallows, picking up shells and examining them with the intense curiosity of the young. An adult mending a fishing net woven from plant fibers. Another scraping a sealskin with a stone tool, preparing it to be dried and turned into waterproof clothing. They do not know they are the first human beings to live on this coast. They do not know that the land to the east has never heard a human voice. They do not think of themselves as pioneers or explorers or discoverers. They are simply living, following the food, raising the children, telling stories around the fire as the light fades, watching the sea, that vast, cold, generous, indifferent sea that feeds them and that stretches westward to a horizon that never ends. The Kelp Highway carried them south, mile by quiet mile, century by quiet century. And behind them, invisible and unimaginable, the ice began, very slowly, to melt. Even though we now know they were not the first Americans, not even close to the first, the Clovis people remain one of the most fascinating and important chapters in the story of human life in the Americas. They appeared in the archaeological record roughly 13,000 years ago, and in the span of just a few centuries, their distinctive and immediately recognizable stone tools spread across an enormous portion of North America. Understanding who they were and what they achieved is essential to understanding the larger story. The discovery of the Clovis culture begins with a man who should be far better known than he is. In the late 1890s, a man named George McJunkin was riding his horse along the edge of a dry creek bed called Wild Horse Arroyo, near the small town of Folsom in northeastern New Mexico. McJunkin was a remarkable person. Born into slavery in Texas, he had gained his freedom after the Civil War and taught himself to read, to play the fiddle, to survey land, and to observe the natural world with a scientist's precision and a poet's curiosity. By the late 1890s, he was working as a ranch foreman, one of the most respected cowboys in the area. On that day, McJunkin noticed something in the eroded wall of the arroyo. Large bones, larger than the bones of any cattle or bison he had ever seen. They were clearly old, embedded deep in the sediment. McJunkin recognized that they were significant. He collected some of the bones and spent years trying to get scientists and museum officials to come out and look at the site. Most of them showed little interest. A black cowboy in rural New Mexico, no matter how knowledgeable, was not the kind of person the scientific establishment of the early 20th century was inclined to listen to. George McJunkin died in 1922 without ever seeing his discovery properly investigated. Several years later, scientists finally did come to the area. At the Folsom site near where McJunkin had found his bones, and later at a nearby site even closer to the small town of Clovis, they found something that changed the history of American archaeology. Stone spear points of extraordinary craftsmanship, lying in direct association with the bones of animals that had been extinct for thousands of years. Mammoths, giant species of bison. These were animals from the Ice Age. And here were human-made tools embedded among their bones. The Clovis points, as the tools from the Clovis area site came to be called, were unlike any stone artifacts found before. They were leaf-shaped, beautifully symmetrical, and expertly thin, with sharp, finely worked edges. But their most distinctive feature was a channel or groove, called a flute, that had been carefully chipped into the base of the point on one or both faces. This fluting ran from the base partway up the body of the point, making it thinner and narrower at the base. The purpose of the fluting was almost certainly practical. A thinner base would fit more easily and more securely into the split end of a wooden or bone spear shaft, creating a strong, tight joint between the stone point and the handle. Making a Clovis point was an act of extraordinary skill, patience, and knowledge. The process began with selecting the right stone. Not just any rock would do. Clovis knappers sought out fine-grained, homogeneous, glassy stones that fractured predictably and cleanly. Flint, jasper, chalcedony, obsidian. Each type of stone had its own properties, its own strengths and weaknesses, its own personality. Clovis knappers sometimes traveled astonishing distances to obtain the right material, or they acquired it through long-distance trade networks. Finished Clovis points have been found made from stone whose geological source is hundreds of miles away. Once the right stone was selected, the knapper would begin shaping it through a process called bifacial reduction. Using a hard stone cobble or, more commonly, a billet made from antler or dense bone, the knapper would strike controlled blows along the edges of the raw stone, removing thin flakes from alternating sides. Each blow had to be precisely angled and precisely placed. Remove too much from one side and the point becomes asymmetric. Strike at the wrong angle and the stone may shatter unpredictably. Strike with too much force and you remove more material than intended. Too little force and nothing happens. It is a craft that demands both physical skill and a deep, intuitive understanding of how stone behaves under stress. After the basic leaf shape was established, the napper would refine the edges through careful pressure flaking, using a pointed tool of antler or bone to press small, controlled flakes off the edges, making them sharper and more regular. Then came the most technically demanding step of all, the one that defined Clovis technology and that separated master craftspeople from apprentices. The fluting. To create the flute, the napper would prepare the base of the nearly finished point with great care, creating a small platform at the very bottom from which the fluting flake would detach. Then, with a single precisely aimed blow, they would strike this platform, sending a thin, elongated flake running up one face of the point. If everything went well, the flake would detach cleanly, leaving a smooth, concave channel running from the base partway up the body. If things went wrong, and they frequently did, the force of the blow would snap the point in half, destroying hours of careful work in an instant. Archaeologists who have studied Clovis production sites, places where points were manufactured in quantity, have found significant numbers of broken points, failures from the fluting stage. Even the most skilled nappers had a failure rate. Modern experimental nappers who have spent years learning to replicate Clovis points report that the fluting step remains the most nerve-wracking part of the process. One well-known napper described it as holding your breath and hoping. Another said it felt like a form of meditation, requiring complete concentration and a calm, steady hand. The finished Clovis points are objects of genuine beauty. They are thin, symmetrical, sharp, and graceful. Some are made from translucent stone that glows with warm light when held up to the sun. Their proportions are balanced and pleasing to the eye. They are, in every meaningful sense of the word, works of art as well as functional tools. And they were effective tools. Clovis points were primarily used as tips for thrusting spears or throwing spears, weapons designed for hunting large game. Several archaeological sites show clear evidence of mammoth hunts in which Clovis-tipped spears were used to kill and butcher the enormous animals. At the NACO site in Arizona, 8 Clovis points were found among the ribs and vertebrae of a single mammoth. At the Leaner site, also in Arizona, 13 Clovis points were found with the remains of at least 9 mammoths. But it would be a mistake to think of the Clovis people as only mammoth hunters. That was just one part of their lives. Archaeological evidence from Clovis sites across North America shows that they were highly adaptable generalists who hunted and ate whatever the local environment offered. At some sites, the primary prey was bison. At others, smaller animals like rabbits, turtles, and birds make up most of the faunal remains. Plant foods, though harder to detect in the archaeological record, were almost certainly an important part of the Clovis diet, as they are for all known hunter-gatherer peoples. The remarkable speed at which Clovis technology spread across North America has long been one of its most striking features. Within just 2 or 3 centuries, a span of time so brief it is almost invisible in the archaeological record, Clovis points appear at sites from coast to coast, from the Canadian border to Central America. How did this happen so fast? There are 2 basic explanations, and most archaeologists today believe the answer involves elements of both. The first is that a relatively small population of Clovis people migrated rapidly across the continent, carrying their tool technology with them and leaving Clovis points in their wake. The second is that the Clovis toolkit, once invented, spread rapidly among human populations that were already living in North America, adopted from group to group because it was so effective, like a useful new technology being passed from one community to the next. If the second explanation is at least partly correct, and the pre-Clovis evidence strongly suggests that it is, then it has a profound implication. It means there were already people in North America before the Clovis toolkit appeared. The Clovis phenomenon was not the arrival of people. It was the arrival of a new idea, a new way of making tools, spreading among people who had been here for a long time already. The Clovis period was remarkably brief. It lasted from roughly 13,000 to roughly 12,700 years ago, a span of only 300 years or so. Then the distinctive fluted points disappear from the archaeological record, replaced by a wide variety of different regional tool styles. Fulsome points, which are smaller and even more finely made than Clovis, appear on the Great Plains. Different styles emerge in the southeast, the northeast, the Pacific coast. The uniformity of the Clovis period gives way to regional diversity. The Clovis people did not vanish. Their descendants simply adapted, as people always do, to new and changing conditions. The world around them was transforming. The great ice sheets were melting. The climate was warming. The megafauna were disappearing. And the people responded, developing new tools and new strategies suited to the new world they found themselves in. Picture a Clovis craftsperson sitting on a flat rock in the shade of a tree on a warm afternoon. A piece of fine-grained chert rests in one hand, an antler billet in the other. The world is quiet. The steady, rhythmic sound of antlers striking stone fills the air. A thin flake of stone flies off and lands in the grass. Another follows. Slowly, carefully, with infinite patience, a beautiful object emerges from a lump of raw rock. The craftsperson turns the stone in the light, studying its grain, reading its structure the way a musician reads a score. Finding the next place to strike. Taking a breath. Striking. It is a process that demands stillness and focus. A kind of meditation. The world shrinks down to the point of contact between the antler and the stone, and everything else falls away. The sounds of the camp behind them. The wind in the grass. The distant trumpeting of a mammoth herd on the move. Just stillness. Just the stone. Just the slow, patient work of making something beautiful from something raw. Not so different from the stillness you might be feeling now. There is something dreamlike about the world that the first Americans knew. Something that feels more like a fairy tale or a fantasy novel than like real history. Because the world they walked into was a world full of giants. Animals of a size and diversity that seem almost impossible from our modern perspective. Animals that would stop you in your tracks and leave you staring in disbelief. But they were real. They were as real as the deer and squirrels you might see in a modern park. And they walked the same ground you walk on today. Their bones are in the earth beneath your feet. Let us step into that world for a few minutes. Let us see it as the first Americans saw it. You are standing on a broad, grassy plain in what is now the American Midwest. The time is roughly 15,000 years ago. To the north, if you look carefully, you can just make out a faint white line on the distant horizon. That is the edge of the ice sheet, still enormous, still covering most of what will one day be Canada. But here, where you are standing, the land is open and green. Tall grass stretches in every direction, rippling in a steady wind that smells of earth and pollen and sunshine. The sky above is enormous, pale blue at the zenith, fading to white near the horizon, dotted with high, thin clouds. And across this landscape, moving and feeding and resting and watching, are animals that would make you gasp. Columbian mammoths. These are not the woolly mammoths of Siberia, though they are close relatives. Columbian mammoths lived south of the ice sheets, in what are now the temperate and subtropical regions of North America. And they were even bigger than their woolly cousins. A full-grown Columbian mammoth stood roughly 13 feet tall at the shoulder, about the height of a single-story building. Their tusks were massive, curving upward and inward in great sweeping arcs, sometimes reaching 12 feet in length or more. Unlike the heavily furred woolly mammoths of the Arctic, Columbian mammoths had somewhat less body hair, better suited to the milder climate of southern North America, though they were still large and powerful enough to shrug off any cold that came their way. They move across the grassland in a family group of about a dozen, led by an older female, the matriarch, just as African elephants are led by their oldest and wisest female today. The group moves slowly, unhurried, pulling up bunches of grass with their flexible trunks and stuffing the grass into their mouths with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency. A baby mammoth, perhaps a year old, walks close to its mother's side, its small trunk swinging and curling experimentally as it tries to imitate what the adults are doing. Mammoth calves took years to learn the complex feeding techniques of their elders, and they relied on their mother's milk for as long as 2 years. The bond between a mammoth mother and her calf was probably as strong as the bond between an elephant mother and her baby today. Near the edge of a stand of trees, Something large is moving with exaggerated slowness. It is a ground sloth. Not the small, endearing tree sloths of the modern Central and South American tropics, animals that could fit comfortably in your arms. This is Megalonyx jeffersonii, the giant ground sloth, named partly by Thomas Jefferson, who was an avid naturalist as well as a president. Megalonyx was roughly the size of a large ox. It stood about 6 feet tall at the shoulder when on all fours, and considerably taller when it reared up on its hind legs, which it did frequently to reach leaves and branches high in the trees. Its body was covered in a thick coat of coarse, shaggy fur. Its claws were enormous, long, curved, and powerful, designed not for fighting but for grasping tree limbs and pulling them down within reach of its small, muscular mouth. Megalonyx moved through the world with a ponderous, swaying gait that suggested a complete indifference to haste. It had no reason to hurry. At its size, with its thick hide and powerful limbs, very few predators would have considered attacking it. It was a gentle, slow, leaf-eating giant, about as threatening as a very large, very hairy cow. Along the river, a sight that surprises many modern people. A herd of horses. Yes, horses. In Ice Age America. This is one of the great ironies of natural history. The horse, Equus, evolved in North America. It first appeared on this continent roughly 4 million years ago and diversified into numerous species, some of which migrated to Asia and Europe over the Bering Land Bridge during previous ice ages. Horses thrived in North America for millions of years. They were a natural, integral part of the North American ecosystem, as native to this land as bison or deer. The horses you see along this river are smaller than the modern domestic horse, with thicker necks, shorter legs, and heavier bodies, built for endurance and adapted to the grassland environment. They graze in a loose herd, heads down, tails swishing at the flies. In a few thousand years, they will be gone from North America, extinct along with the mammoths and the sloths and so many others. They will not return to this continent until the Spanish bring their domesticated descendants across the Atlantic in the early 1500s. The mustangs that later roamed the American West were not wild animals discovering a new land. They were the remote descendants of an American animal coming home after a very long absence. And the list of giants goes on. American camels, tall, slender, graceful animals related to the ancestors of modern Middle Eastern camels and South American llamas. Like the horse, the camel evolved in North America and spread to other continents. Glyptodon, a relative of the armadillo the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, its entire body enclosed in a dome of bony armor plates, its heavy, club-like tail a defensive weapon that could shatter the leg of any predator foolish enough to attack from behind. Giant beavers, castoroids, the size of black bears, with huge chisel-shaped teeth, living along the rivers and lakes. Stag moose, servalses, with bizarre, elaborately branched antlers that seem designed by a surrealist sculptor. Dire wolves, Oenosian Dryas, heavier and more robust than modern gray wolves, with stronger jaws and more massive teeth, hunting in large packs across the plains and forests. And the predators. American lions, Panthera atrox, significantly larger than modern African lions, with longer legs and leaner bodies, suggesting they may have been faster runners. Scimitar cats, Homotherium, with long, serrated, blade-like upper canine teeth, probably ambush predators that specialized in bringing down young mammoths and horses with a quick, slashing attack. And the most famous predator of them all, Smilodon fatalis, the saber-toothed cat. Not as large as the American lion, but more powerfully built, especially in the shoulders and forelimbs. Its upper canine teeth were nearly 7 inches long, protruding below the lower jaw like curved ivory daggers even when the mouth was closed. Those teeth were not for biting in the conventional sense. They were for driving deep into the flesh of large prey after the animal had been wrestled to the ground by Smilodon's immensely strong front legs. Above it all, soaring on thermals that rose from the sun-warmed grassland, condors. Teratornis mariami, the giant teratorns, were related to modern condors and vultures but were even larger, with wingspans exceeding 12 feet. They circled endlessly on the wind, scanning the ground below for the carcasses of dead animals, their sharp eyes spotting a fallen mammoth or bison from miles away. This was the world the first Americans inhabited. A world of astonishing biological richness. A world where giants walked and where the cycle of life and death played out on an epic scale. And the people who lived among these creatures were not passive observers. They were active participants in this ecosystem. They hunted these animals, or at least some of them. They scavenged the kills of the great predators when they could. They competed with the wolves and the lions and the bears for access to the herds. They knew these animals intimately, their habits, their movements, their strengths, their vulnerabilities. This knowledge was survival. A family that understood the seasonal movements of the mammoth herds, that knew when and where the bison would gather near water, that could read the body language of a saber-toothed cat well enough to know whether it was hunting or merely passing through, had a significant advantage over a family that did not. We should resist the temptation to romanticize this world, to see it as a pristine paradise where humans lived in perfect harmony with nature. Life in the Ice Age was hard. It was cold. Food was not always available. Predators were real dangers. Children died. People suffered injuries that, without modern medicine, could be crippling or fatal. Life expectancy was shorter than ours. But we should also resist the temptation to see it as a world of constant, desperate struggle. The archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age Americans were generally well-fed, resourceful, and socially connected. They had technology. They had fire. They had warm clothing. They had each other. They were not clinging to survival by their fingernails. They were living fully and competently in a world that was harsher than ours but also richer in some ways, wilder, more vast, more alive. And then, within a few thousand years, the giants began to disappear. One by one, species by species, the great animals of the Ice Age vanished from the Americas. The mammoths, the ground sloths, the horses, the camels, the saber-toothed cats, the dire wolves, the giant beavers, the glyptodons. Gone. Not just from one region, but from the entire hemisphere. What happened to them is one of the great puzzles of natural history. And it is where we are heading next. But for now, let the image of that ancient grassland rest in your mind like a painting you can return to whenever you wish. The wind moving through the tall grass. The slow, majestic passage of a mammoth family across the plain. The cry of a hawk overhead. The distant sound of a river. A world that no longer exists, but that was, for a long time, the only world anyone knew. Between roughly 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened to the animal life of the Americas. More than 35 genera of large mammals disappeared from North America alone. Genera, not individual species. Each genus contained multiple species, so the total number of species lost was even higher. It was one of the most devastating extinction events in the entire history of mammalian life on Earth, and it happened with a speed that, in geological terms, was almost instantaneous. Think about what was lost. The mammoths, both woolly and Columbian. Every species of ground sloth, from the ox-sized megalonyx to the even larger megatherium of South America, which stood nearly 20 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. All the Native American horses, every single species, gone from the continent where the horse had evolved and thrived for 4 million years. The American camels. The glyptodons. The giant beavers. The stagmoose. The dire wolves. The American lions. The scimitar cats. Smilodon the saber-toothed cat. The short-faced bear. The giant tortoises. The enormous teratorns. Species after species after species, disappearing within a few thousand years. South America experienced similar losses. So did parts of Europe and Northern Asia, though the extinctions there were somewhat less severe. But nowhere on Earth were the losses as dramatic as in the Americas. North America went from having a diversity of large mammals comparable to, and in some ways exceeding, that of modern-day Africa to having only a handful of surviving large species. Bison, moose, black bears and grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves, a few others. But the great bestiary of giants that had defined the continent for millions of years was gone. What happened? This question has consumed scientists for more than half a century, generating passionate debate, occasional acrimony, and a vast body of research that has not yet produced a consensus. There are three principal hypotheses, and the truth, as is often the case with complex historical events, almost certainly involves elements of more than one. The first hypothesis is human overkill. This idea was most forcefully articulated by the geoscientist Paul Martin of the University of Arizona, beginning in the 1960s. Martin's argument was straightforward and powerful. The large animals of the Americas had evolved over millions of years without ever encountering human predators. They had no instinctive fear of people. They did not recognize humans as dangerous. They were, in Martin's memorable and widely quoted phrase, ecologically naive. When human hunters arrived in the Americas, armed with effective weapons, sophisticated cooperative hunting strategies, and tens of thousands of years of experience hunting large animals in Asia, the megafauna were catastrophically vulnerable. They did not know to run. They did not know to hide. And by the time natural selection could have taught them to fear humans, it was too late. Their populations had been hunted below the threshold of viability. Martin called this the Blitzkrieg model, suggesting a rapid wave of extinction that swept across the continent as human hunters expanded into new territory. He pointed to a striking global pattern. Whenever human beings first arrived on a new landmass or a large island, the megafauna there tended to disappear shortly afterward. In Australia, most of the continent's giant marsupials vanished within a few thousand years of human arrival, roughly 50,000 years ago. In Madagascar, the giant lemurs, the elephant birds, and the pygmy hippos disappeared within centuries of human colonization, roughly 2,000 years ago. In New Zealand, the giant moa birds, some standing more than 10 feet tall, went extinct within about a century of Polynesian arrival, roughly 700 years ago. In each case, the pattern was the same. Humans arrive. Large animals that have never seen humans before die out. The overkill hypothesis has compelling logic and some supporting evidence. The timing of the extinctions in the Americas broadly coincides with the period of human expansion across the continents. Several archaeological sites show direct evidence of humans hunting and butchering megafauna species, including mammoths and mastodons. And the pattern of extinctions is selective in a way that is consistent with human hunting. The animals that went extinct were predominantly large-bodied and slow-reproducing, exactly the kind of animals that are most vulnerable to hunting pressure because they cannot replenish their numbers quickly enough to compensate for increased mortality. The second hypothesis is climate change. The transition from the Ice Age to the Holocene brought profound and rapid changes to the climate, vegetation, and hydrology of the Americas. Temperatures rose. Rainfall patterns shifted. The vast grasslands that had supported mammoth herds and bison herds for millennia began to shrink as forests expanded. Water sources that had been reliable for thousands of years dried up or moved. Seasonal patterns changed. The entire ecological framework within which the megafauna had evolved and thrived was being dismantled and reorganized at a pace that may have outstripped the ability of large, slow-reproducing animals to adapt. Mammoths, for instance, were supremely adapted to cold, open grasslands. Their massive bodies, their specialized teeth designed for grinding tough grasses, their behavioral patterns of long-distance seasonal migration, all of these were fine-tuned by millions of years of evolution to fit a specific type of environment. When that environment began to disappear, replaced by forests and warmer, wetter conditions, the mammoths were caught in an evolutionary trap. They could not adapt quickly enough. Their habitat was shrinking around them, fragmenting into smaller and smaller patches, cutting off migration routes and isolating populations that were too small to sustain themselves over the long term. Proponents of the climate hypothesis point out that the end of the Ice Age was not the first time Earth had experienced rapid warming. There had been previous interglacial periods, warm intervals between ice ages, and the megafauna had survived those transitions. This is a fair point, but it is also worth noting that the transition from the last Ice Age to the Holocene was particularly rapid and extreme in some respects, and the megafauna populations entering this transition may have already been under stress from previous cold periods. The third hypothesis is more speculative and more controversial. In 2007, a group of scientists led by Richard Firestone proposed that roughly 12,800 years ago, A comet or a fragment of a comet struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere above the North American ice sheet. This impact, they argued, triggered massive wildfires across the continent, disrupted the climate, caused or contributed to the sudden return to near-glacial cold known as the Younger Dryas, and dealt a devastating blow to both the megafauna and the human populations, including the Clovis people, who depended on them. The evidence cited for the impact hypothesis includes unusual concentrations of nanodiamonds, microspherules, and other materials that can be formed by intense heat and pressure in sediment layers dating to approximately 12,800 years ago, a layer known as the Younger Dryas boundary. However, the hypothesis has been intensely debated, with some researchers questioning the identification of the supposed impact markers and others finding the evidence inconsistent or unreplicable. As of now, the cosmic impact hypothesis remains a minority view, interesting and not entirely dismissed, but far from established. So what do most researchers believe today? The emerging consensus, to the extent that there is one, is that the megafauna extinctions were caused by a combination of factors working together. The prevailing view might be described as a synergy of stresses. The climate was changing rapidly, disrupting habitats and food supplies. The megafauna were already under pressure, their populations declining, their ranges fragmenting. And then human predators arrived, adding a new and significant source of mortality to populations that were already struggling. Humans did not need to hunt every last mammoth to extinction. They did not need to wage a war of extermination against the ground sloths or the saber-toothed cats. They simply needed to reduce the reproductive success of already stressed populations by a small but consistent margin. If a mammoth population is already declining because its habitat is shrinking, and then human hunters begin killing even a small number of individuals each year, the combined effect can push the population below the threshold of sustainability. Once a population of large, slow-reproducing animals drops below a certain size, it enters what ecologists call an extinction vortex, a downward spiral from which recovery becomes increasingly unlikely. Genetic diversity declines. Inbreeding increases. Each generation is smaller and weaker than the last, until, eventually, the last individuals die, and the species is gone. Think of it as a glass balanced on the very edge of a table. Climate change pushed the glass to the brink. Human hunting gave it the last, small, fatal nudge. And down it fell. The consequences of the megafauna extinctions rippled through the entire ecosystem. Without the great herds of grazers, mammoths, horses, ground sloths, the grasslands changed. Vegetation grew denser and taller. Fire regimes shifted because the unraised vegetation accumulated more fuel. Seed dispersal patterns changed dramatically because many plants had depended on large animals to eat their fruits and carry the seeds long distances in their digestive tracts, depositing them in new locations in piles of nutrient-rich dung. Even the composition of the soil changed, because the trampling and grazing of millions of large animals had been a fundamental force in shaping grassland ecosystems for millions of years. And the people adapted. Humans always adapt. That is perhaps the single most defining characteristic of our species. When the megafauna disappeared, the people who had hunted them shifted their focus. They hunted bison, which survived the extinction event, probably because bison reproduce relatively quickly for their size and because they were adapted to a wider range of habitats. They hunted deer and elk. They trapped rabbits and caught fish. They gathered plants with increasing sophistication, developing new tools for processing seeds, nuts, and roots. In some regions, over thousands of years, this increasing reliance on plant foods would eventually lead to the development of agriculture, the deliberate planting and tending of crops, which would in turn give rise to the great civilizations of the Americas. But something irreplaceable was lost when the giants died. A richness, a wildness, a dimension of the natural world that can never be recovered. The Americas today, beautiful as they are an impoverished version of what they were 15,000 years ago. We live in a world of ghosts, walking through landscapes that were shaped by animals we have never seen and will never see. Let that thought settle softly in your mind. Not as a source of sadness, though sadness is natural, but as a reminder That the world is older and stranger and more fragile than we sometimes remember. That what is lost can be mourned but not brought back. And that the choices we make as a species have consequences that echo for thousands and thousands of years. The giants are gone. The earth remembers them. And now, so do you. We have spent a long time talking about ice sheets and migration routes, about dating controversies and extinction theories. These are important topics, and they form the framework of the story. But they can also make the first Americans seem abstract, like chess pieces on a map rather than real people living real lives. So let us do something different now. Let us slow down. Let us zoom in. Let us spend a single day with a small group of people living in what is now the eastern United States, roughly 12,000 years ago, and see what their world actually felt like from the inside. The great ice sheets have mostly retreated northward by this time. The climate is warming, though it is still cooler than today. The landscape is a mosaic of different habitats, open meadows and grasslands, patches of forest dominated by oak, hickory, and pine, wetlands along the rivers and lakes, and rocky hillsides where ferns and mosses grow in the shade. Most of the megafauna are gone, but the land is still rich with life. White-tailed deer are common. Turkeys move through the forest understory. Fish crowd the rivers during spawning season. Nuts ripen on the trees in autumn. It is a good land, a generous land, but it demands knowledge, skill, and effort to live here. Dawn comes slowly. There is no electric light to cheat the darkness, no alarm clock to cut the silence. What wakes you is the gradual brightening of the sky, a faint gray glow seeping through the opening in the shelter where the hide covering does not quite reach the ground. The air inside the shelter is cool and smells of smoke, of cured leather, of the dried grass that lines the sleeping area. Around you, other members of your family are beginning to stir. Someone shifts under their deerskin blanket. A child murmurs something in their sleep, a sound as old as the human species itself, and rolls closer to the warmth of the person beside them. The first task of the day, as it has been for humans since the discovery of fire more than 100,000 years ago, is to rekindle the hearth. Someone rises quietly, careful not to wake the children, and moves to the fire pit at the center of the camp. The fire from last night has burned down to a bed of gray ash and dull red embers. They kneel beside it and blow gently on the embers, a long, steady breath, and the dull red brightens to orange. Small twigs and shreds of dried bark are added. A thin wisp of smoke rises. Then a tiny flame appears, pale and tentative in the early light. More twigs. A slightly larger stick. The flame grows. Within a few minutes, the fire is alive again, crackling softly, casting a small circle of warmth and light into the cool morning. Fire is everything to these people. It is warmth in the cold. It is light in the dark. It is the means by which raw food becomes safe, digestible, and delicious. It is protection from predators. It is the center around which social life revolves. These people do not take fire for granted the way modern people take electricity for granted. They understand it. They tend it. They respect it. They carry embers with them when they move camp, wrapped in bundles of damp moss to keep them smoldering, because starting a new fire from scratch using friction or percussion is possible but tedious, and keeping an existing fire alive is much easier. Breakfast is simple but nourishing. Strips of dried venison, meat from a deer that was killed several days ago, cut into thin strips and hung over the low, smoky fire to dry. Smoking and drying meat was one of the most important food preservation techniques available to these people, allowing them to store protein for days or weeks without refrigeration. The dried meat is tough and chewy, requiring strong teeth and patient jaw work, but it is rich in protein and keeps well. Alongside the dried meat, there are nuts. Hickory nuts, perhaps, or walnuts, shelled and stored in a bark container. Nuts were a critical food resource for people throughout the eastern woodlands of North America. They are calorie-dense, rich in fats and proteins, and when properly stored, they can last through the lean winter months. Acorns, which grow abundantly in the oak-dominated forests of the east, were also an important food, but they require processing before they can be eaten. Acorns contain tannins, naturally occurring compounds that make them taste bitter and astringent and that can cause stomach upset if consumed in quantity. But if you crack the acorns, remove the nut meat, and soak it in running water for several days, changing the water frequently. The tannins leach out, leaving behind a bland, nutritious, starchy food that can be ground into flour, mixed into stews, or pressed into cakes and baked on a hot stone beside the fire. This is not simple gathering. This is food processing, a technology requiring knowledge that was passed down from mother to daughter and father to son over generations. If the season is right, perhaps late spring or early summer, there might be fresh plant foods as well. Wild onions, pulled from the moist soil along the riverbank. Young shoots of various greens, tender and slightly bitter, eaten raw or added to a simmering stew. Berries, if they are in season, blackberries, elderberries, serviceberries, sweet and bursting with juice, eagerly consumed by children and adults alike. After the morning meal, the day's work begins, and work for these people is not the monotonous, specialized, clock-driven affair that it is for most modern humans. Their work is varied, physical, skilled, and intimately connected to the natural world. Different people do different things depending on the needs of the day, the season, their skills, and their age. Stone tool making is one of the most important and constant activities. Without metal, stone is the primary material for every tool that needs a sharp edge, knives for cutting meat and hides, scrapers for cleaning and softening animal skins, projectile points for the tips of spears and atlatl darts, choppers for breaking bones to get at the nutritious marrow inside. Making good stone tools is not a simple matter of banging two rocks together. It is a sophisticated craft that requires deep knowledge of geology, of the physical properties of different types of stone, and of the precise techniques needed to control the way stone fractures. A skilled napper sits cross-legged on the ground with a lap pad of folded leather to protect their thighs from sharp stone fragments. A lump of raw chert rests in one hand. In the other, a billet made from the tine of a deer antler, dense and slightly elastic, ideal for delivering precisely controlled blows to the edge of the stone. The napper studies the stone for a moment, turning it in the light, reading the color, the grain, the tiny imperfections that will affect how it fractures. Then they strike. A clean, sharp blow at precisely the right angle. A thin flake of stone detaches and flies off into the grass, its edge as sharp as broken glass. The napper examines the result, turns the stone, and strikes again. And again. And again. Slowly, deliberately, flake by flake, a functional tool emerges from the raw stone. The sound of stone napping is one of the characteristic sounds of this world. A rhythmic, almost musical tapping. It carries across the quiet camp on the morning air, steady and calming, like the ticking of a clock. Not far from the napper, two women are working a deer hide. This is a long, labor-intensive process that transforms a raw, stiff, perishable animal skin into soft, supple, durable, water-resistant leather suitable for clothing, bags, moccasins, and shelter coverings. First, the hide is staked out flat on the ground, flesh side up, and scraped clean of all remaining tissue and fat using a heavy stone or bone scraping tool. This requires considerable strength and endurance, as the scraping must be thorough. Any flesh left on the hide will rot. Then the hide is turned over and the outer surface is scraped as well, removing the coarse guard hairs if a smooth leather is desired. After scraping, the hide is treated with a mixture of the animal's own brain and water. This technique, known as brain tanning, works because the natural oils and phospholipids in brain tissue penetrate the collagen fibers of the hide and prevent them from bonding rigidly together as the skin dries. The result is leather that remains soft and flexible instead of drying into a stiff, board-like sheet. After the brain solution is worked thoroughly into every part of the hide, the skin is stretched, wrung, pulled, and worked with the hands until it is completely dry and uniformly soft. The entire process, from raw hide to finished leather, takes several days of hard physical work. Children in this world learn not from books or classrooms but from observation, imitation, and practice. A young girl sits near the women who are working the hide, watching their movements intently. Occasionally, one of the women hands her a small scraping tool and lets her practice on a scrap of leftover hide. The girl's strokes are clumsy and uneven, but she is learning. A boy follows the older men down to the river, where fish weirs have been constructed from rocks and woven branches. The weirs funnel fish into narrow channels where they can be caught by hand or with simple nets. The boy watches how the men read the water, how they position themselves, how they time their grab. He is learning too. Play and education are indistinguishable. Children throwing sticks at a target on a tree are developing the hand-eye coordination and spatial judgment they will need as hunters. Children wading in the shallows of the river, turning over rocks, chasing crayfish, are learning about the aquatic environment that provides a significant portion of their family's food. And children sitting beside adult nappers, picking up discarded stone flakes, and attempting to shape them into tools are learning the most important craft of their culture. Archaeologists sometimes find these children's practice pieces at ancient sites, small, clumsily made stone tools with uneven flaking and awkward proportions. They are instantly recognizable as the work of small, unskilled hands imitating what they have seen adults do. They are, in their way, among the most touching and human artifacts in all of archaeology. Homework assignments from 12,000 years ago. As the afternoon wears on, someone returns from a foraging trip carrying a bundle of wild plants. Tubers that resemble small, knobby potatoes. A handful of wild onions. Some leafy greens. These are brought back to the camp and added to a stew that has been slowly cooking since mid-morning in a depression in the ground lined with a piece of hide or a section of bark, filled with water, and heated by the repeated addition of stones that have been heated in the fire until they are extremely hot. This technique, called stone boiling, allows you to heat water to a simmer without placing a container directly on the fire, which would burn a hide or bark vessel. You heat a stone in the fire until it is nearly glowing, then use 2 sticks or a forked branch to lift it from the fire and lower it carefully into the water. The stone releases its heat into the water, and the temperature rises. Add more hot stones, and you can keep the stew simmering for as long as you want. The smell of the cooking stew drifts through the camp. A rich, savory, comforting smell. Meat and root vegetables and wild herbs, simmering together in hot water. It is one of the oldest and most universal smells in the human experience, the smell of food cooking, and it is as comforting and inviting now as it was 12,000 years ago. As evening comes on and the light fades from the sky, the family gathers around the central fire. The day's work is done. The stew is ready. People eat, using their fingers or perhaps simple wooden or bark utensils. They share the food. They talk. The older children play quietly on the edge of the firelight. The younger children, full of food and warmth, begin to nod off, their small bodies leaning against parents or older siblings. And then, in the way that humans have done for as long as there have been humans, someone begins to tell a story. Perhaps it is an older person, a grandmother or grandfather, whose voice has the particular quality that comes with age and experience. We do not know what stories they told. Stories leave no physical trace. They do not fossilize. They do not leave flake scars or radiocarbon signatures in the soil. But we know, as certainly as we know anything about the ancient past, that these people had stories. Every human culture ever studied, without exception, has had stories, songs, and oral traditions. The first Americans were no different. They told stories about the animals they knew, about the places they had been, about the people who came before them, about how the world began, and where the rivers came from, and why the stars are arranged the way they are. You are listening to a story right now, of course. A voice in the darkness, telling you about a world you have never seen, while you lie still and let your mind drift. The impulse is the same one that drew those ancient people together around the fire 12,000 years ago. The need for a voice. The comfort of a narrative. The ancient, deep, unshakable human hunger for stories. The fire burns low. The stars appear overhead, thick and brilliant and numberless in a sky unmarred by any artificial light, more stars than you have ever seen, the Milky Way a bright, luminous river arching from one horizon to the other. The night sounds of the forest fill the darkness around the camp, crickets, frogs, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint rustle of something moving through the underbrush. The fire crackles softly. And one by one, the people fall asleep. Not so different from you. One of the most important things to understand about the first Americans is that there was no single group. There was no one migration, no one journey, no one people who populated two entire continents. The peopling of the Americas was a complex, layered, and ongoing process involving multiple groups, multiple routes, and multiple waves of migration stretching across thousands and thousands of years. For a long time, the story was told as though it were simple. One group crossed the land bridge. They spread across the continent. End of story. But the evidence, and especially the genetic evidence, tells us something far more interesting and far more nuanced. In the past 2 decades, the study of ancient DNA has revolutionized the field. Scientists can now extract and analyze genetic material from human remains that are many thousands of years old, reading the molecular record of ancestry and migration that is written into every cell. And what they have found has transformed our picture of how the Americas were settled. Here is the broad outline that genetics gives us. The ancestors of Native Americans originated in Northeast Asia, most likely in the region of modern-day Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China. This much was long suspected and has been firmly confirmed by genetic studies. The DNA of Native American peoples, both modern and ancient, is most closely related to the DNA of populations in Northeast Asia. But the ancestral population was not a single, uniform group. Genetic analysis shows that it was formed by the mixing of at least 2 distinct Asian source populations. One of these was related to a group that geneticists call the ancient North Eurasians, people whose genetic signatures are found across northern Asia and who are also distantly related to some European populations. The other was an East Asian population, related to the ancestors of modern Chinese, Japanese, and other East Asian peoples. When these 2 groups mixed, probably in or near Beringia during the long standstill we discussed earlier, they created a new, genetically distinctive population. And it was this blended population that gave rise to most or all Native Americans. The genetic evidence also shows that when people finally moved from Beringia into the Americas, they did not move as a single group in a single wave. There were at least 2 and probably 3 or more distinct waves of migration at different times. The first and by far the largest wave was the initial settlement of the Americas, the movement of people southward from Beringia into North and South America. This first wave gave rise to the great majority of indigenous American populations, from the Innu of eastern Canada to the Mapuche of southern Chile and everyone in between. Despite the enormous cultural and linguistic diversity among these peoples, they share a common genetic ancestry that traces back to this initial founding population. A second, somewhat later wave brought the ancestors of the Na-Dene-speaking peoples. The Na-Dene language family is one of the largest and most widespread in North America. It includes the Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest coast, the various Athabascan or Dean peoples scattered across a vast area of northwestern Canada and interior Alaska, and, far to the south, the Navajo and Apache of the American Southwest. Genetically, Na-Dene speakers carry a distinctive signal that sets them apart from other Native Americans, suggesting that their ancestors entered the Americas in a separate migration, probably several thousand years after the initial wave. A third wave, the most recent major pre-Columbian migration, brought the ancestors of the Inuit, Yupik, and Aleut peoples, who spread across the Arctic and subarctic from Alaska to Greenland. This migration was remarkably recent and remarkably fast. The ancestors of the Inuit appear to have arrived in the western Arctic roughly 5,000 years ago, and within 1,000 years or so, they had spread across the entire top of North America, reaching Greenland and establishing a presence on both sides of the Bering Strait. It was one of the fastest large-scale human migrations in history, carried out by people who had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated set of technologies for living in the Arctic, including kayaks, umiaks, toggling harpoons, snow houses, and warm, tailored clothing made from caribou and seal skins. Within these broad waves, as people spread across the vastly different landscapes of the Americas, they diversified. Groups that settled in the deserts of the Southwest faced entirely different challenges and developed entirely different adaptations than groups that settled in the temperate forests of the East Coast, or the tropical lowlands of Central America, or the high plateaus of the Andes, or the windswept grasslands of Patagonia. Over thousands of years, This process of local adaptation and cultural divergence produced the extraordinary diversity of indigenous American cultures that existed at the time of European contact. The linguistic evidence gives us a sense of the depth of this diversity. Before Columbus, the Americas were home to more than 1,000 distinct languages, belonging to dozens of different language families. Some of these language families are as different from each other as English is from Japanese or Swahili. You cannot develop that kind of linguistic diversity in a few thousand years. It takes deep time, many thousands of years of separation and independent development, for languages to diverge to that extent. The sheer number of language families in the Americas is itself powerful evidence that humans have been here for a very long time. And then there are the genetic surprises, the findings that nobody predicted and that nobody can fully explain yet. In 2018, a team led by geneticist Esk Willersleff published the genome of an infant found at the Upward Sun River site in interior Alaska. The child, a girl, had died at roughly 6 weeks of age approximately 11,500 years ago. Her genome revealed something astonishing. She did not belong to any known Native American population. She belonged to a previously unknown group that the researchers named the ancient Beringians. This group appeared to be a sister population to all other Native Americans, meaning they shared a common ancestor but had diverged very early, probably in Beringia itself, before the main ancestral Native American populations split into northern and southern branches. The ancient Beringians seem to have stayed in Alaska while other groups moved south. Before this tiny girl's DNA was analyzed, nobody knew this population had ever existed. The Anzac child, the Clovis-era infant buried in Montana with more than 100 stone tools, provided another key piece of the puzzle. When Esk Willersleff and his colleagues sequenced the Anzac child's genome and published it in 2014, they found that this 12,600-year-old boy was more closely related to modern indigenous peoples of Central and South America than to most modern indigenous peoples of North America. This was unexpected. It suggested that the ancestors of South American peoples had passed through North America relatively quickly, while the ancestors of many North American groups either arrived later or occupied different territories. And there is one more mystery that deserves mention. In the genomes of certain indigenous groups in the Amazon basin, geneticists have detected a faint but real genetic signal that connects these South American peoples to populations in Australia, Melanesia, and the Andaman Islands of the Indian Ocean. This signal has been called Population Y, or the Australasian signal, and it is one of the most puzzling findings in the entire genetics of the first Americans. How did a genetic connection to Australasian peoples end up in the Amazon? No one knows for certain. Some researchers have proposed an early, otherwise undetected migration across the Pacific. Others think the signal may represent very ancient shared ancestry that predates the settlement of the Americas. The question remains open, a reminder that the genetic story of the first Americans still contains deep mysteries. The study of ancient DNA is not without its tensions and ethical complexities. For many indigenous communities, the scientific analysis of ancestral remains raises profound concerns about respect for the dead, about who has the right to tell the story of the ancestors, and about how that story is used. The history of the relationship between Western science and indigenous peoples is not always a comfortable one, and the study of ancient human remains has sometimes been conducted without adequate consultation or consent. Today, the best research in this field is done in genuine partnership with indigenous communities, with their knowledge, their input, their permission, and their participation. This collaborative approach produces better science and more complete understanding, because indigenous peoples bring perspectives, knowledge, and questions that outside scientists might never think to ask. And the results belong not just to the scientific community but to the descendant communities whose ancestors are being studied. The genetic story tells us something beautiful and profound. The Americas were populated not by one journey but by many. Each journey brought different people with different skills, different knowledge, different ways of understanding the world. And from that diversity, over thousands of years, emerged the extraordinary tapestry of indigenous American cultures, one of the richest and most varied collections of human traditions anywhere on Earth. Many paths, many peoples. One great, still unfolding story. Just when it seemed like the worst was over, just when the great ice sheets were retreating and the world was warming and new forests were spreading across the land, something happened that no one could have predicted. Something sudden. Something that, for the people living through it, must have felt like the world going wrong. The cold came back. Roughly 12,900 years ago, after several thousand years of gradual, steady, seemingly unstoppable warming, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped suddenly and dramatically. In some areas, particularly around the North Atlantic, average temperatures fell by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit within just a few decades. In human terms, that is terrifyingly fast. That is within a single lifetime. Imagine growing up in a world that is getting warmer every year, watching the forests spread, watching the animals change, and then, in the span of your own adult life, watching the cold return. Watching the trees die. Watching the glaciers creep southward again. This period is called the Younger Dryas, named after a small, tough little white wildflower called Dryas octopetala, mountain avens that thrives in cold, harsh, tundra-like environments. When scientists studying ancient pollen in lake sediments across Europe noticed a sudden, dramatic increase in Dryas pollen in layers dating to this period, they recognized it as a marker of the cold's return. The little flower, spreading across landscapes that had been too warm for it just a few decades earlier, was a silent witness to a climate catastrophe. What caused the Younger Dryas? The most widely accepted explanation involves a disruption of ocean currents. During the normal retreat of the ice sheets, enormous volumes of meltwater flowed off the glaciers and into the ocean. Most of this water reached the sea gradually, through rivers and streams. But at some point around 12,900 years ago, something much more dramatic may have happened. A massive glacial lake, known as Lake Agassiz, which covered an area roughly the size of the modern Black Sea in what is now central Canada, may have catastrophically drained, either because an ice dam holding it back suddenly collapsed or because the water found a new outlet as the ice receded. The result would have been one of the largest floods in Earth's history, a staggering volume of cold, fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic in a geologically brief period. This freshwater flood disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great system of ocean currents that carries warm, salty water from the tropics northward along the surface of the Atlantic and brings cold, dense water back southward along the bottom. This circulation is the engine that keeps Western Europe and northeastern North America relatively mild for their latitudes. When the freshwater from Lake Agassiz diluted the surface water of the North Atlantic, it became less salty and therefore less dense. It stopped sinking. The circulation weakened or shut down entirely, and the flow of tropical warmth to the north stopped with it. Temperatures plummeted. The Younger Dryas lasted roughly 1,200 years, from about 12,900 to about 11,700 years before the present. For the people of the Americas, it was a long, grinding ordeal. The warming trend that had been transforming the landscape for thousands of years reversed itself. Forests that had been spreading northward retreated. Grasslands dried out and shrank. Animal populations shifted. Food sources that people had depended on for generations became unreliable or disappeared. The Younger Dryas coincides closely in time with several other significant events in the Americas. The end of the Clovis culture. The final extinction of several remaining megafauna species. A period of apparent population decline or reorganization among human groups across North America. It was a time of stress and change. But it was also, as times of crisis so often are, a time of adaptation and innovation. In different regions, people responded to the Younger Dryas in different ways. Some groups became more mobile, expanding their range and diversifying their diet to compensate for the reduced availability of any single food source. Others became more sedentary, hunkering down in favorable locations and intensifying their use of local resources, particularly aquatic resources like fish and shellfish, which were less affected by the climate change than terrestrial animals and plants. New tool types appeared. New food processing techniques developed. New social arrangements may have emerged as people adapted to the changed conditions. Halfway around the world, in the Levant, the younger Dryas appears to have played a role in one of the most consequential transitions in all of human history, the invention of agriculture. People in the Levant who had been harvesting wild wheat and barley found that the cold, dry conditions of the younger Dryas made these wild grain fields less productive and less reliable. In response, some of them began deliberately planting the seeds of their preferred grain varieties, watering and tending the young plants, and harvesting the results. It was the first tentative step toward farming, and it would eventually lead to the domestication of cereal crops, the growth of permanent settlements, and the rise of civilizations. Whether a similar dynamic was at work in the Americas during the younger Dryas is still an area of active research. The earliest clear evidence of plant domestication in the Americas, the cultivation of squash and later of maize, comes somewhat later. But the stresses of the younger Dryas may have set the stage for agricultural experiments that would bear fruit in the millennia to come. The younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures in the northern hemisphere rose rapidly, possibly within the span of a single decade. The ocean currents apparently restarted. The cold released its grip, and the world entered the Holocene epoch, the warm, relatively stable climatic period in which we are still living today. Feel the warmth of that transition settling over you now. The ice retreating for the last time. The rivers flowing freely again. The first wildflowers pushing through the newly thawed soil. A world growing green again after 1,000 years of cold. And the people, tempered by hardship, strengthened by adaptation, walking into a new and gentler era with all the knowledge and resilience that their ancestors had earned. We have talked about migration and survival, about tools and food and the practical business of staying alive in a challenging world. But human beings are more than just eating and sleeping machines. We are creatures of meaning. We are storytellers, artists, mourners, dreamers. We look at the world around us and we ask why. We look at death and we wonder what comes next. We look at the stars and we make patterns. We are, as far as we know, the only species on this planet that buries its dead with flowers. The first Americans were no exception. From the very earliest evidence we have, these were people of depth and complexity, people whose inner lives were as rich and developed as their material lives. Let us begin with one of the most powerful and intimate types of evidence that archaeology can offer: a burial. In 1968, near the small town of Wilsall in southwestern Montana, construction workers preparing a site for a new building accidentally disturbed an ancient burial. Beneath a thick layer of red ochre, a natural iron oxide pigment, they found the remains of a young child, probably about 18 months old. Surrounding the child's body were more than 100 stone tools, including some of the finest and largest Clovis points ever found. The tools were clearly not everyday working implements. They were too large, too perfect, too elaborately made. They appeared to be ceremonial objects, made specifically for the burial, or perhaps cherished possessions offered to the child in death. This is the Anzac burial, and it dates to roughly 12,600 years ago. It is one of the oldest known burials in the Americas, and it speaks volumes about the people who created it. Consider what this burial tells us. A community that has lost a very young child, probably barely past infancy, chose to mark that loss with enormous care and effort. They did not simply discard the body. They prepared a grave. They gathered more than 100 stone tools, objects that represented many hours of skilled craftsmanship, and placed them with the child. They covered the body and the offerings with red ochre, a substance that has been associated with death, ritual, and the boundary between the living and the dead in human cultures across the world for more than 100,000 years. This was not a casual act. This was ceremony. This was grief expressed through ritual. This was the visible manifestation of a belief system, a set of ideas about death, about the afterlife, about the obligations of the living to the dead. We cannot know the specific beliefs these people held. We cannot reconstruct the words that were spoken over the grave or the songs that were sung. But we can know, with certainty, that they had beliefs. That this child's death mattered to them. That they loved this child and mourned this child and tried, in their way, to send the child onward with everything they might need. The DNA of the Anzac child, analyzed by geneticist Esk Willersleff and published in 2014, showed that this 12,600-year-old infant was genetically a Native American, more closely related to modern indigenous peoples of Central and South America than to most modern Northern Native American groups. In 2014, after the scientific study was completed, the child's remains were reburied in a ceremony attended by representatives of several Native American tribes. A 12,000-year-old child, buried with love, disturbed by accident, studied by science, and returned to the earth. The circle closed. Beyond burial, rock art offers another window into the spiritual and intellectual world of the first Americans. Across the Americas, from the Canadian Shield to the tip of Patagonia, ancient people left images on stone surfaces that have survived the ravages of time. These images are found in caves, on cliff faces, in sheltered overhangs, on boulders in open landscapes. They were made using a variety of techniques: painting with pigments made from ground minerals mixed with water or animal fat, pecking and carving into the rock surface with harder stones, and sometimes a combination of both. Some of this art is clearly representational. Animals, humans, hunting scenes, figures that may represent dances or ceremonies. In the caves of Baja California, in Mexico, enormous painted figures, some more than 10 feet tall, stretch across the cave ceilings in vivid reds, blacks, and yellows. The figures appear to be human, with arms raised, and they are surrounded by smaller images of deer, rabbits, fish, and other animals. The style is bold and dramatic, unlike anything else in the Americas. In the rock shelters of Patagonia, the Cueva de las Manos, the Cave of the Hands, thousands of hand stencils cover the rock walls. The stencils were made by placing a hand flat against the stone surface and spraying pigment around it, leaving the outline of the hand in the natural color of the rock, surrounded by a cloud of color. Most of the hands are left hands, which makes sense if you think about it, because most people are right-handed and would hold the spraying tool in their dominant hand while pressing their non-dominant hand against the wall. These stencils are more than 9,000 years old, and they are one of the most moving sights in all of archaeology. Thousands of hands, reaching out across millennia. Each one the hand of a real, individual person. Each one saying, in a language that needs no translation, "I was here. I existed. Remember me." Other rock art is abstract, geometric patterns that do not seem to represent any recognizable object or scene. Spirals, concentric circles, zigzag lines, grids, dots arranged in patterns. These abstract images appear in rock art traditions around the world, and archaeologist David Lewis Williams has proposed that some of them may represent entoptic phenomena, visual patterns produced by the human nervous system itself during altered states of consciousness. Fasting, sleep deprivation, rhythmic drumming, prolonged meditation, and the ingestion of psychoactive plants can all produce these characteristic patterns as the brain generates spontaneous visual activity in the absence of normal sensory input. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains debated among scholars, then some of the abstract rock art of the ancient Americas may not depict the external world at all. It may depict the internal world, the visions and experiences of individuals undergoing spiritual journeys, quests for meaning and connection that took them beyond the boundaries of ordinary consciousness. We should hold such interpretations gently and with humility. We are separated from the people who made this art by thousands of years and vast cultural distances. Their meanings may have been very different from anything we can imagine. But what we can say with confidence is that these were people of imagination and depth. They did not merely exist. They created. They made beautiful things. They left their marks on the world. And they did so not only for practical reasons, but for reasons of the spirit. In many indigenous traditions that have survived to the present day, specific places in the landscape carry deep spiritual significance. Mountains, rivers, springs, caves, particular rock formations, individual trees, all can be understood as sacred, as alive with spiritual power, as connected to the stories and the identities of the people who live near them. Archaeologist Robert Kelly has suggested that this sense of sacred geography almost certainly has very deep roots, extending back to the very earliest inhabitants of the Americas. The first Americans did not simply use the land. They entered into a relationship with it. A relationship of reciprocity, of respect, of spiritual connection. Close your eyes if they are not already closed, and let yourself imagine a dark, quiet cave. The air is cool and damp. It smells of stone and earth. Somewhere, water drips. A small fire or torch flickers, throwing dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. And there, on the wall, a human hand reaches out and presses flat against the rock. The hand is wet with ochre, red as blood, red as sunset. When it pulls away, a print remains. Vivid, unmistakable. A human hand. Left there thousands of years ago by a person who felt something that needed to be expressed. A person who wanted to leave a mark. A person who wanted to say, without words, something about being alive and being here and being part of this world. And thousands of years later, here you are. Hearing about it. Thinking about it. Feeling something. The connection holds. For most of the history of American archaeology, the study of the first Americans was conducted primarily by people who were not themselves indigenous. Western-trained scientists, working within Western academic institutions, using Western scientific methods. The stories were told from the outside. And for a long time, the stories that indigenous peoples themselves told about their origins, their migrations, and their history, the oral traditions passed down from elder to child across hundreds and even thousands of generations, were largely dismissed by the scientific establishment as myth, legend, or folklore, interesting perhaps as cultural artifacts, but unreliable as historical evidence. This attitude is changing, and the change is making the entire story richer and more complete. Indigenous oral traditions are not the same thing as archaeological data. They do not come with radiocarbon dates or stratigraphic context. They are stories, shaped and reshaped by generations of telling, carrying meanings and purposes that go far beyond the simple recording of historical events. But that does not mean they contain no historical information. In fact, a growing body of evidence suggests that carefully maintained oral traditions can preserve astonishingly accurate information across very long periods of time. The Heiltsuk First Nation of the central coast of British Columbia provides one of the most compelling examples. The Heiltsuk have oral traditions that describe their ancestors taking refuge on a specific stretch of coastline during a time when the surrounding land was covered in ice. When archaeologists investigated the area described in these traditions, working in partnership with the Heiltsuk community, they found evidence of human habitation dating back roughly 14,000 years, to the very end of the last ice age. The oral tradition and the archaeological evidence told the same story, arrived at from different directions, confirmed by different methods. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, the oral traditions of several indigenous groups contain accounts of catastrophic floods, enormous walls of water rushing across the landscape with devastating force. Geologists have documented exactly these events. The Missoula floods, which occurred repeatedly between roughly 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, were among the largest floods in Earth's history. Glacial Lake Missoula, a vast body of water held in place by an ice dam in what is now western Montana, burst through its dam perhaps 40 or more times over a span of 2,000 years. Each time the dam broke, an almost inconceivable volume of water, estimated at more than 500 cubic miles, roared across eastern Washington at speeds that may have exceeded 60 miles per hour, carving deep channels into the bedrock and creating the stark, dramatic landscape known today as the channeled scablands. The indigenous stories and the geological evidence describe the same events, remembered from very different perspectives, preserved by very different methods, across thousands of years. From Australia, another body of work provides striking parallels. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been found to contain accurate descriptions of coastal geography that was submerged by rising seas more than 7,000 years ago. Stories describe bays that are now deep underwater, islands that no longer exist above the surface, and stretches of coastline that have not been dry land for millennia. The Australian linguist Patrick Nunn has documented more than 20 indigenous stories from around the Australian coast that describe real events of sea level rise, preserved in cultural memory for an almost incomprehensible span of time. What this body of research tells us is that oral traditions, when they are important to a community and when they are transmitted carefully and deliberately, can be far more durable and far more accurate than Western scientists traditionally assumed. The human capacity for preserving information through speech, story, and song is greater than we gave it credit for. This does not mean that oral traditions should be read as straightforward historical documents. They were never intended to function that way. They are stories, and stories operate by different rules than scientific reports. They convey truth through metaphor, through emotion, through narrative structure, through the resonance of images and symbols. A creation story that says the people emerged from the earth in a particular place is not making a geological claim about volcanic activity or cave systems. It is making a statement about identity, about belonging, about the deep, unbreakable connection between a people and their homeland. Learning to hear and respect these truths, to understand what oral traditions are saying in their own terms rather than forcing them into the framework of Western science, is one of the great ongoing challenges of modern archaeology. And it is a challenge that many archaeologists are now embracing with genuine enthusiasm. Today, an increasing number of archaeological projects in the Americas are conducted in partnership with indigenous communities. This is not merely a matter of political correctness or good public relations. It is good science. Indigenous peoples possess deep, detailed, and often irreplaceable knowledge about the landscapes they have inhabited for generations. They know where specific resources can be found. They know how water behaves in different seasons. They know the habits and movements of local animals. They know which plants are useful and how to process them. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries and millennia, can guide archaeological research in directions that outside scientists might never think to explore on their own. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed by the United States Congress in 1990, was a watershed moment in the relationship between science and indigenous peoples in America. The law requires that human remains, funerary objects, and sacred items held by federally funded museums and agencies be returned to culturally affiliated tribes upon request. It was passed in response to decades of archaeological practices that, however well-intentioned, had shown too little regard for indigenous perspectives on the treatment of ancestral remains. The story of the first Americans belongs, ultimately and most directly, to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. It is their ancestors whose bones are in the ground, whose tools are in the museum cases, whose DNA is being sequenced in the laboratories. Their voices, their knowledge, their perspectives are not supplementary to the story. They are central to it. Any telling of this history that does not include them is incomplete. Listen. The wind carries old voices. Not words, exactly. Not anything you can transcribe or translate. But something. A thread of continuity. A vibration. A resonance that connects the people of today to the people of 100 centuries ago, unbroken, undiminished, alive. The story flows on. Let it carry you. Before we rest, there is one final thing to understand about the story of the first Americans. It is not finished. This is not a settled history, locked away in textbooks and museum exhibits, complete and closed. This is one of the most active, most rapidly changing, and most exciting fields in all of science. Every year, sometimes every month, brings new discoveries that add detail, challenge assumptions, or open entirely new avenues of investigation. The picture of how and when the Americas were first settled has changed more in the last 25 years than in the previous century. And it will change again. We have already discussed the most dramatic recent discovery, the White Sands footprints and their dates of more than 20,000 years ago. But other sites are pushing the boundaries even further, though not all of their claims have been universally accepted. In the Chiquihuite Cave, located high in the mountains of Zacatecas in central Mexico, archaeologist Cyprian Ardelean and his colleagues reported in 2020 that they had found stone tools in sediment layers dating back as far as 30,000 years ago. If these dates are confirmed, Chiquihuite would represent one of the oldest known traces of human activity anywhere in the Americas, predating even the White Sands footprints by several thousand years. The tools found at Chiquihuite are unusual, different in style from the tools found at other early American sites. Some researchers have suggested that they might represent an early, perhaps unsuccessful wave of migration, People who entered the Americas but whose lineage eventually died out or was absorbed into later populations. The Chippewa White dates are controversial. Some archaeologists question whether the objects identified as tools are genuinely human-made or whether they might be naturally fractured stones that coincidentally resemble artifacts. This is a debate as old as archaeology itself, the problem of distinguishing human workmanship from the work of nature at the very edge of the evidence. The debate is ongoing, as it should be. This is science working properly. In South America, several sites continue to push at the boundaries. At the Toca de Tirapia rock shelter in northeastern Brazil, stone tools have been reported in layers dating to more than 20,000 years ago. At Arroyo del Vizcaino in Uruguay, bones of giant ground sloths bear marks that some researchers interpret as cut marks from stone tools, with dates suggesting an age of roughly 30,000 years. These claims are not universally accepted, but they contribute to a growing body of evidence suggesting that the human presence in the Americas may extend much further back in time than the traditional models ever imagined. Underwater archaeology is opening an entirely new frontier. Along the coast of British Columbia, the Hawkeye Institute is using advanced sonar technology and remotely operated submersible vehicles to map the ancient, submerged coastline, searching for the traces of the earliest coastal settlements. Off the coast of Florida, divers exploring underwater sinkholes that were once dry caves have found stone tools, butchered animal bones, and other evidence of human activity dating to more than 14,000 years ago. These submerged sites are extraordinarily difficult to study, but each one that is found and documented adds another piece to the puzzle. New technologies are transforming the field in ways that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. Environmental DNA analysis, the extraction and identification of genetic material preserved in ancient soil, can now detect the former presence of specific species, including humans, at a site even when no bones or artifacts have been found. Imagine being able to tell that humans once occupied a cave simply by analyzing the dirt on the cave floor. This technique has the potential to revolutionize the search for early human sites in the Americas. Optically stimulated luminescence dating provides an alternative to radiocarbon dating for sites that are very old or where suitable organic material for carbon dating is not available. This was the technique that provided the third independent confirmation of the White Sands dates. LiDAR, a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to create detailed three-dimensional maps of the ground surface even through dense forest canopy, has revealed previously unknown archaeological features across the Americas. In the Amazon basin, LiDAR surveys have uncovered vast networks of ancient earthworks, raised roads, canals, and geometric patterns that show the Amazon rainforest was far more densely inhabited and far more extensively modified by human activity than scientists previously believed. What are the biggest questions that remain open? The timing question is still not fully resolved. When did the very first humans arrive in the Americas? White Sands gives us a firm minimum date of 21 to 23,000 years ago. Chippewa White and a few other controversial sites suggest possibly 30,000 years or more. But the earliest dates are still debated, and the gap between what is widely accepted and what is possible remains significant. The route's question is still open. The Pacific coastal route now seems very likely to have been the primary path for the earliest arrivals, but the interior ice-free corridor was probably used as well, at least by some later groups. And there may have been other routes entirely, paths that we have not yet imagined or identified. The population question is fascinating. How many people were involved in the initial settlement? Genetic modeling suggests that the founding population of the Americas was surprisingly small, perhaps just a few hundred individuals, or even fewer. From that tiny seed, all the vast diversity of Native American peoples eventually grew. It is a remarkable example of what a small number of human beings can accomplish, given enough time. And then there is the largest question of all. What do we not yet know to ask? The history of this field teaches us that the most transformative discoveries are often the ones that come completely out of left field, findings that no one predicted and no one was looking for. The White Sands footprints were not something anyone expected to find. The ancient Beringian genome from upward Sun River was not something anyone predicted. The next great discovery in the study of the first Americans might be equally unexpected, emerging from some corner of the evidence that we have not yet thought to explore. This is the beauty of an unfinished story. There is always more to find. Always another question to ask. Always another site waiting to be discovered, another genome waiting to be sequenced, another puzzle piece waiting to be fitted into the growing picture. The Earth keeps its secrets well, revealing them slowly, one at a time, to those patient and persistent enough to look. Rest now. The questions will be here in the morning. And somewhere, tomorrow or next week, or next year, someone will brush the soil from something extraordinary. And the story will grow by one more piece. We have come a long way tonight. We began at the edge of a world of ice, standing on the vast, windswept grasslands of Beringia, looking eastward toward a continent that no human being had ever seen. And from that starting point, we have traveled across thousands of miles and thousands of years. We have seen the world as it was during the last glacial maximum, locked in ice, its oceans drawn back, its coastlines redrawn. We have walked the lost land of Beringia and met the mammoths and the people who lived among them. We have followed the Kelp Highway along the Pacific coast, that quiet road of seaweed and shellfish and salt air. We have knelt beside the footprints at white sands and marveled at the smallness of a child's bare foot pressed into mud more than 20,000 years ago. We have stood with the archaeologists who fought for decades to prove that people were here before Clovis, and we have seen their patience rewarded. We have watched a Clovis craftsperson shape a spear point from raw stone with nothing but skill and an antler billet. We have walked among the giants, mammoths and ground sloths and saber-toothed cats and horses that would one day vanish from this land. We have mourned the great dying that took them. We have sat by a 12,000-year-old campfire and eaten food cooked with hot stones and watched the stars come out in a sky that knew no artificial light. We have read the genetic story written in the DNA of the living and the dead. We have shivered through the younger Dryas and felt the warmth return. We have stood in a dark cave and looked at red handprints on stone and felt the presence of another human being reaching across the centuries. We have listened to the voices of indigenous peoples whose ancestors lived this story and whose descendants carry it forward. And we have learned that the story is not one story. It is many stories, many paths, many peoples, many journeys made by many different groups over many thousands of years, by boat and on foot, along coastlines and through mountains, across ice and through forests, in warmth and in bitter, bone-deep cold. The peopling of the Americas was not a single event. It was a process, long and complex and still not fully understood, and it produced the extraordinary diversity of indigenous cultures that flourished across two continents for millennia. What does this story teach us? It teaches us that human beings are resilient. The first Americans faced challenges that would seem insurmountable to most of us. Ice ages, catastrophic climate reversals, the extinction of the great animals they had depended on. And they survived every single one of these challenges. They adapted. They innovated. They changed their tools, their diets, their strategies, their entire way of life when the world demanded it. And their descendants carried that resilience forward through hundreds of generations, building cultures and civilizations that rival any the world has ever seen. It teaches us that human beings are curious. The first Americans did not cross Beringia because somebody ordered them to. They crossed it because something in them, something deep and fundamental and unquenchable, wanted to know what was on the other side of the horizon. That same curiosity drives the scientists who study them today, digging in the earth, diving to submerged coastlines, reading the messages hidden in strands of ancient DNA. And it is the same curiosity that brought you to this story tonight. It teaches us that human beings are connected. Across time. Across space. Across all the apparent boundaries of culture and language and geography. The DNA in your cells connects you, however distantly, to people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. The ground beneath your feet, wherever you are, holds the traces of lives lived long before yours. You are here tonight because every single one of your ancestors, stretching back in an unbroken chain for hundreds of thousands of years, survived long enough to have children. Every one of them faced their world with whatever courage and skill they could muster, and every one of them made it through. You are the living proof of their success. And this story teaches us humility. For all our science and technology, for all the brilliant work of archaeologists and geneticists and geologists and linguists, there is so much we still do not know. The Earth keeps its secrets. It reveals them slowly, reluctantly, one bone and one footprint and one fragment of stone at a time. Each answer we find raises a dozen new questions. And we must be comfortable with that. We must be willing to sit with uncertainty, to embrace mystery, to say the three most powerful and most honest words in all of science. We do not know. If this journey has given you something tonight, a fact you did not know, a sense of wonder you did not expect, a quiet place to rest your mind as the day falls away, then it has done what it was meant to do. If it has meant something to you, perhaps you might share it with someone else who could use a calm voice and a long, quiet story to carry them into sleep. You might leave a thought about where you are listening from tonight, about which part of this ancient, storied land is holding you as you rest. But you need not do anything at all. There is nothing required of you now. Nothing to remember. Nothing to decide. Nothing to do but rest. The first Americans walked into the unknown with courage and curiosity. They carried their children on their backs and their knowledge in their stories. They watched the stars from landscapes that no longer exist, and they wondered, as you wonder, about the meaning of it all. They did not have answers to every question. Neither do we. But they kept walking. They kept looking. They kept asking. Their footprints are in the earth. Their tools are in the soil. Their DNA is in the living. Their story is the oldest American story there is, and it is still being told, still being discovered, still being understood. It will never be finished, and that is the most beautiful thing about it. The stars are out. The fire has burned down to embers. The wind moves softly across the grass, carrying the scent of earth and water and growing things. Somewhere beneath the ground, a secret waits to be found. But not tonight. Tonight is for rest. Wherever you are, whatever you carry, know this. You are part of a story that is older than memory and wider than the sky. A story of footsteps in white sand, of kelp swaying in cold, dark water, of stone shaped by patient, steady hands, of children playing beside ancient rivers, of red handprints reaching from cave walls across the centuries, of people, always people, walking forward into the unknown with nothing but each other and the quiet, stubborn, inextinguishable belief that there is something good ahead. The story will be here when you wake. Good night.